Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. You've come to the right place, a quiet corner of history where the past still simmers softly and the fire crackles low. Tonight we won't speak of swords or kings or the dust of battle. Instead, we'll slip gently into the kitchens and fields of the Middle Ages, into clay ovens and crooked tables, into wooden bowls and bread-stained aprons. You see, there's a truth rarely told in fairy tales or dusty scrolls. Medieval people ate, every day, just like us. And what they ate, well, it wasn't always gruel. It was warm and weird, simple and strange, hearty and hopeful. So settle in, let your thoughts grow quiet. Let the flicker of the hearthlight paint the walls of your imagination, and let us tell you a story, not of hunger, but of how people filled their bellies long ago, in a world of smoke, soil and stew. Okay now, dim the lights. Let the hush of night gather around you like a blanket. Let the quiet settle in your bones. Take a slow breath and come with me. Back to a time when ovens were made of stone, when spices were worth more than gold, and when every meal was a kind of prayer to the season, the soil, and sheer survival. It begins with a scent. Not a bad one, not yet, but warm, earthy. Maybe it's the crust of baking bread. Maybe it's onions sweating in a pot. Maybe it's smoke curling through the beams of a low kitchen ceiling. The kind that stays in the air and in your clothes and in your memories. Because in the Middle Ages, food wasn't just nourishment. It was time, labour, weather, class, and hope. And tonight that's the story we'll quietly slip into. There is a kind of peace in repetition, in the simmering of a pot, the folding of a cloth, the rhythm of chopping and stirring and waiting. Long ago, in that time of winding roads and timbered homes, medieval people lived by those rhythms. They planted when the frost lifted. They harvested when the sun lingered. They stored what they could, shared what they had, and hoped the seasons would be kind. And always they ate. Not all at once, not always enough. But food was a part of life just as surely as prayer or sleep. And while the word gruel may echo in our minds when we picture the past, a thin grey slop served in a wooden bowl, the truth, as always, is more textured. Let us walk first into the world of the peasant. The farmer, the field worker with earth under their nails and hunger nestled beneath their ribs. For them, food was survival. It came from their own hands or not at all. Their days began not with eggs and ham, but with black bread, dense, sour, made of rye or barley and baked in communal ovens or at the edge of a hearth. This bread, often rough and dark, was dipped in pottage, a humble stew of oats, lentils, onions, and whatever greens the garden or the forest could spare. It changed with the months. In spring it was bright with leeks and herbs. In winter it dulled, thickened and stretched with turnips and dried beans. Meat was a guest, not a resident. On rare days, feast days, saints' days, a neighbour's wedding, there might be bacon or a salted herring or a pigeon caught by luck and sling. Cheese was common, though coarse. Eggs too, when the hens were willing. And there was ale, always ale. Safer than water, lighter than wine, brewed in barrels with yeast passed down like family secrets. But step into the manor, into the tiled kitchens of the gentry, and the table changes. The bread is white, soft with wheat from far-off fields. The stews are rich with venison, boar or swan, layered with spices, saffron, clove, cinnamon, not because the meat was foul, but because flavour was wealth. Pies danced with surprises. Inside one crust, a herbed lamprey. Inside another, a custard of eggs and honey. Sometimes even live birds flapped from a cut pie, just for show, a noble trick to make the hall erupt in laughter. Feasts were performances. People didn't just eat, they watched others eat, served on silver platters by servants in livery. After the meat came marzipan, shaped like castles or dragons. After the sweets, wine spiced with rosemary. It wasn't just food, it was spectacle. But in between these extremes, between the mud and the manor, lay the markets, the monasteries and the midsummer fairs. Food was traded, sold and blessed. At monasteries, vegetables grew in sacred order and monks harvested them in silence. At fairs, one might find roasted nuts, cheeses wrapped in wax, or even spiced apples dipped in honey for a coin or two. In the villages, ovens were shared, recipes were borrowed, and cabbage stew simmered while children chased geese through courtyards. The seasons shaped every bite. In spring, nettle soup warmed the bones. In summer, there were berries, sweet and fleeting. Autumn gave apples, nuts and smoked sausages, tucked away for the frost to come. Winter demanded cleverness, the pickling of onions, the salting of fish, the drying of herbs tied in bundles from crooked rafters. They cooked over open hearths with iron cauldrons, wooden spoons, and stone ovens blackened with years of smoke. They baked in clay pots, boiled in brass, stirred with sticks. There were no forks, only fingers and knives, and shared bowls where many mouths met. Sometimes they ate at home, knees bent on rush-strewn floors. Sometimes they gathered in great halls beneath tapestries and candlelight. Sometimes they ate in the fields, breaking bread beneath the sky, wiping sweat and flour with the same hand, and always they ate together because hunger was never solitary. A loaf was split, a stew was stirred for all. Even in famine, even in fear, the act of eating was communal, human, sacred. So no, it wasn't just gruel. It was bread baked with love, stew flavoured with memories, ale poured for laughter. And somewhere someone, tired from the field, warmed by the fire, closed their eyes with a belly finally full. That was a feeling not taken for granted. In the Middle Ages, fullness was a small triumph, a fleeting victory over hunger and weather and work. And every bite before that fullness had been touched by many hands, dug from the dirt, carried in baskets, traded in markets, washed in stream water, sliced on wooden boards worn smooth by years of use. There was no corner store, no pantry with tins and packets. Food had to be found, grown or preserved, and often all three. In the meadows and woods, the careful eye could find nettles, wild garlic, sorrel, and mushrooms sprouting in secret. Hazelnuts and chestnuts dropped in autumn with a dull thud. Elderberries and sloes blushed from brambles. Even flowers found their way to the table. Violets in syrup, rose petals in wine, marigolds in butter. In river towns, eels writhed in wicker traps and trout flashed in nets. Mussels clung to rocks, pried free with hands red from the cold. At the coast, salt was scraped from flat pans, packed into sacks and sold in spoonfuls that could mean the difference between preserved meat and rot, and how they preserved. Meat salted and hung, fish dried on lines. Apples wrinkled in hay-filled bins. Even eggs were buried in ash, safe until the snow melted. Milk became cheese, thick or crumbly depending on the region. Butter was churned in long, aching rhythm and tucked away in earthen pots. They cooked on open flames in iron cauldrons with clay pots blackened by soot. The kitchens echoed with the scrape of spoons and the hiss of oil, the thump of dough being kneaded on boards slick with flour. Fires had to be coaxed. Coals banked. Every meal was a choreography of patience. And there were rules. The church said no meat on Fridays or during Lent or on the eve of a holy day. So they ate peas, onions, pickled herring or almond milk stews, rich and odd to modern tongues. Fasting wasn't always voluntary, but it was sacred, a hunger offered up to heaven. Then came Easter feasts, harvest suppers, Yule tables groaning with spiced bread and sweet mead. Even the poor shared more on those days. Flatbreads cooked on stones, honey cakes for children, a single goose that fed a village. Laughter echoed in the rafters, candles flickered in horn lanterns, and for a while, the worry of winter lifted. So when someone's belly was full, when they leaned back on a bench, wiped their mouth with the back of a hand and sighed, it meant more than satisfaction. It meant season, survival, community. Because food wasn't just eaten. It was felt. It was woven into the rhythm of bells and frost and faith. And in every crumb, there was a story. And sometimes, just sometimes, the pot held something rare. Venison. Not from a butcher's stall or a village coop, but from the forest. From the hush of trees and the snap of a twig, from the long wait beneath leaves where breath steamed in the cold and the world grew still. The deer did not give itself easily. It was swift, watchful, born to flee. And so when venison arrived at the table, it came with a story, a chase, a triumph, a death. For the nobles, it was a right. Forest laws made sure of that. They alone could hunt freely on protected lands, and venison became a symbol not just of meat but of power. It arrived on platters, steaming and spiced, dressed in sauces made from wine and vinegar and sweet currants, thickened with almonds or breadcrumbs. At feasts it was carved with ceremony, offered with pride, shared, perhaps, but never without reminding all who watched who it had come from and who had not been allowed to take it. But in the quiet places, near the greenwood edge, where laws blurred and bellies ached, sometimes a peasant risked everything for the same prize. A snare in the underbrush, a bow passed down from father to son, And when the meat came home, hidden beneath sacks of turnips or cloaks damp with dew, it was cooked quickly, without fuss. No spices, no ceremony, just fire, just salt if there was any. Still, the taste was the same. Rich, earthy, warming from within. They ate it slowly, reverently, fingers slick, eyes watching the door, because a stolen deer could cost a hand, or worse. But it also fed a family through the cold, gave strength for the next day's labour, gave a child something to dream of besides pottage. Venison was more than a meal. It was memory and risk and reward, all wrapped in the smoke of a hearth. And whether eaten beneath a timbered roof by candlelight or beneath stars in the hush of a hiding place, it was savoured. Always. Because in a world of roots and bread, venison was wildness made edible. Venison was wildness, yes, a taste of the forest. But for most, the pot held something far simpler. Pottage, it was not a recipe, but a rhythm, a thing always in the making. A pot left to simmer day after day beside the hearth where ash softened and smoke curled toward beams blackened with years. Pottage was the heartbeat of the medieval kitchen, ever changing, ever thickening, never truly finished. In it went what the garden offered, a leek pulled from damp soil, an onion stored in straw, a turnip shaped like a knuckle, a handful of beans left from the last harvest. If there was meat, it was a blessing. A bone, a bit of bacon, curled and salty. A rabbit if the snare had been kind. More often, just herbs and hope and time. Children grew up knowing the sound of it, the slow glop as it bubbled, the way a wooden spoon creaked as it was stirred. They dipped crusts of barley bread into it, softening the chew. They waited as mothers tested its taste with the back of a spoon, and fathers sighed in quiet satisfaction when the bowl was passed. No two pots were ever the same. Monday's pottage became Wednesday's stew. By Friday it was something else entirely. Thicker, deeper, stained with whatever life had given or withheld, and it was always shared. From lord to labourer, pottage was the great equaliser. Even kings might start their meals with a lighter version, dressed with herbs and cream served in a silver bowl, but the essence was the same. Warmth, sustenance, a quiet moment carved from a demanding day. It filled the gaps between feast days. It kept the cold from the bones. It was the answer to hunger when nothing else came through the door. And when it was gone, when the bowl had been wiped clean with the last crust of bread, there was a kind of peace, a soft fullness, a steadying, because in a world full of uncertainty, pottage was constant. The next pot would begin tomorrow, and with it, another day, and alongside the pottage, always, there was bread. Not the fluffy kind you might know today, not golden and light with buttered crusts. No, this was something denser, earthier, heavy in the hand and solid in the stomach. Barley bread, the grain of the common folk. Barley grew where wheat could not, in colder fields, in poorer soil, in places where the harvest needed to be reliable, if not elegant. It was ground coarsely, mixed with water, sometimes with yeast or ale balm if the village baker could spare it, and shaped into rounds or flat cakes, then baked in shared ovens or over stones in hearths. The crust was often rough, the inside grey and speckled. It might taste faintly of smoke or of ash if it sat too long in the fire's reach, but it filled the belly. It gave weight to a meal, structure to a day. They used it to scoop stew, to catch the last drips of broth. Children gnawed on crusts until they softened in the mouth. Travellers carried loaves wrapped in cloth, marked with the finger press of the woman who baked it. It was traded, stored, broken in hunger and in joy alike. And for those lucky enough to live near a mill where the stones turned grain into finer flour, the bread grew lighter, mixed sometimes with rye, sifted if one had the time. But barley remained the base, sturdy, reliable, patient. Some made it sweeter if they could, with dried fruit or a drizzle of honey when the bees had been generous. On feast days, it might even be shaped into little figures or loaves marked with crosses, blessed, shared, sacred. But most days, it was plain. And yet it was everything. The first thing to come from the oven's mouth, the last thing to linger in the hand when the bowl was empty. A companion to the poor, a symbol of enough. Because in a time when much was uncertain, bread was not. And as the hearth cooled and the day ended, that final crust beside the fire was comfort itself. But bread was more than food, it was ritual. Each loaf told a story of the land, the labour, the hands that shaped it. The act of kneading was more than motion. It was memory passed from mother to daughter, from grandfather to child. The press of palms into dough, the dusting of flour across a worn wooden board, the whisper of a prayer as it rose near the warmth of the hearth. For the poor, barley and rye were most common, their loaves dense, dark and gritty, mixed sometimes with oat husks or bean flour to stretch the grain further. These breads fed the masses, filled the bellies of workers before the fields, followed shepherds into the hills, and gave strength to stonemasons who built the chapels they'd never sit inside. But not all bread was the same. In abbeys and manors, where wheat was stored in sacks and milled to a finer dust, the wealthy dined on manchette bread, pale and soft, often shaped in rounds as smooth as river stones. It was baked in special ovens, eaten warm with butter, or served cold beside spiced wine and roasted meats. And then there was trencher bread, thick, stale slabs used as edible plates. They soaked up the juices of meat and stew, and when the meal ended, they were either eaten or given to the poor, soaked through with flavour, soft again for a moment before being swallowed in grateful silence. Some loaves were marked with symbols, a cross, a circle, the initials of a saint. These were not decorations, they were blessings, a call for protection or fertility, or simply the hope that there would be enough grain next year to bake again. Even the act of breaking bread was sacred. It was done with reverence, shared with guests, passed across tables both grand and humble. Bread was community and survival and comfort, the one thing that always seemed to be there, even in the hardest times. And so as twilight settled over fields and hearths dimmed to embers, a single heel of bread, torn, chewed, slowly shared, became a kind of peace, a final bite before dreams. And where there was bread, there was often cheese, not wrapped in wax or lined in paper, but nestled in cloth, aged in cellars, or fresh and crumbly from the churn. Cheese was the quiet miracle of milk, transformed with time, salt, and patience into something that could nourish for weeks, even months. In farmsteads, the rhythm of cheese-making followed the seasons. Spring milk, rich from new grass, made cheeses that were soft and sweet. Summer milk held the warmth of long days and was stirred into curds by women who knew, by instinct, when the whey had thinned. Autumn milk, with its golden tint, made stronger wheels for winter, hard, sharp, and storing the last of the pasture's richness. Cows were prized for their yield, but sheep and goats gave milk too, especially in hilltop villages and rocky places where cattle couldn't thrive. Their cheeses were tangy, sometimes smoky, wrapped in herbs or simply left to harden on wooden shelves near the fire. There was fresh cheese, eaten quickly with herbs or honey, soft and white as snow, and aged cheese, cracked and deep-flavoured, carried in packs by travellers and soldiers, eaten in slivers with coarse bread or dried apples. In monasteries, monks perfected their own cheeses, round, firm, orderly, a product of silence and careful turning. Some even believed certain cheeses helped the soul resist temptation, though it's just as likely they helped the body resist hunger. The poor ate cheese when they could, often as a rare treat, a wedge shared on a feast day, or a small cube tucked into a cloth and eaten slowly in the fields. For children, was a joy. For elders, a softness they could still chew, and it paired perfectly with bread, together the staff and spread of medieval life. A bite of crust, a sliver of cheese, a sip of ale or cider, and for a moment everything stilled. The world outside could wait. The work, the worry, the weather, all paused beneath the slow, savouring chew. And in that silence they were nourished. Cheese was more than food, it was a way to capture time. A way to stretch summer into the depth of winter. To hold the richness of milk in a form that didn't spoil, that could travel, that could wait. Each wheel, each lump, each rough-cut wedge told a story, not just of the animal, but of the hands that tended it. The young girl who rose before sunrise to milk the goat, the grandmother who pressed curds with stones, the monk who turned a wheel every evening in the cellar's dim light, whispering prayers between steps. Some cheeses were salted, some were ash-rubbed or rolled in herbs. Others were wrapped in cloth and tucked in straw, kept cool in cellars, or smoked above the hearth where meats hung drying. These were farmhouse cheeses, simple, necessary, flavoured by the wood of the shelf or the air of the region. And there were soft cheeses, eaten fresh, white, spreadable, clean. These didn't last long and so were treasured in the moment. often eaten with honey or herbs, with fruit if the trees had been generous, or simply with a rough heel of barley bread still warm from the fire. In abbeys, cheese was part of the sacred order, made with discipline, recorded with care, recipes passed down not in ink, but in silence, movements practiced daily, from hand to hand over decades. Some monasteries became known for their cheese, sent wheels to distant towns, wrapped in wax and marked with the seal of the brothers who made it. The rich might serve cheese in slices after meat, sharp, elegant, aged in cellars no commoner would ever see. The poor kept theirs closer, on shelves, in crocks, wrapped in waxy leaves or nestled beside onions and dried herbs for flavour. If it moulded, they cut the mould away. If it cracked, they crumbled it into pottage. Even when times were hard, when meat was rare and bread grew thin, cheese remained, a sign that milk had flowed, that someone had waited, turned, watched. That patience had turned spoil into substance. And in the dark hush of winter, when the fields were white and the fire was low, a piece of cheese shared beside the hearth could feel like warmth itself. And just beside the cheese, on the same rough-hewn table, in the same quiet moment, often sat something golden, something soft, honey. It was the sweetness of the medieval world, the gentlest luxury, made not in kitchens but in hives tucked between hedgerows, or in skeps woven from straw, buzzing with life and danger. There was no sugar then, not for most, only honey, and so it was precious. Gathered in the right season, when the flowers had opened and the bees had flown heavy with nectar. The harvest was done with care, sometimes with smoke, always with respect, because a bee sting was pain, yes, but to lose a hive was hunger. The honey itself was thick, sometimes cloudy, sometimes clear. It depended on the flowers, heather, clover, wild thyme. No two jars were ever quite the same. It was kept in pots, stirred into ale, spread on bread, baked into tarts, or swallowed by the spoonful when a throat ached from winter's chill. Children adored it, monks guarded it, nobles flaunted it in golden glazes over roasted birds or pears wrapped in pastry. Even the poor, on feast days or rare summer markets, might manage a lick, a single golden taste of sunlight stored in wax. Honey was also medicine. Mixed with herbs, it soothed wounds. Heated with vinegar, it settled a stomach. For some, it was the taste of comfort. For others, the taste of joy. And in the candlelit corners of kitchens and halls, honey made even the plainest meal feel touched by grace. Because it was more than sweet, it was softness in a hard world, a reminder that some things were given freely, by nature, by bees, by patience. And in the long nights when meat was gone and bread was stale, even a finger dipped in a pot of honey could feel like a blessing. Honey was not just food, it was light, a shimmer on the tongue, a flicker in the gloom of stone-walled kitchens, a trace of summer kept safe in a jar. It was what made meals magical, what turned porridge into pudding, bread into dessert, wine into mead, and for many it was the only sweetness they would ever know. There were no candy stalls, no sacks of sugar lined the pantry, only honey, thick and floral, or sharp and spiced, depending on the bloom. A spoonful in hot milk could soothe a fretful child. A smear on soft cheese became a meal worth remembering. A drizzle on baked apples brought out something golden that the mouth never quite forgot. The bees that made it were tended by monks, by farmers, by women who knew where wild hives hid in the woods. Some bees were kept close, in hives nestled beside herb gardens or behind thatched cottages. Others were hunted, their honey stolen from hollow trees, with courage and smoke and swollen hands. And it wasn't just for eating. Honey was mixed into ointments and tonics, bound with herbs like sage or mint or lavender. It dressed wounds, it cured coughs, it softened calloused skin. In a world with little medicine, it was the sweetest remedy of all. The rich baked with it, spiced cakes, gilded pastries, sweet sauces for roasted game. It adorned their feasts. The poor treasured it, a lick from a spoon, a smear saved for a holy day. It was rarely enough, but always enough to remember. Even candles, those little flames of comfort in the dark, were made from beeswax steeped in honey scent. And so honey didn't just sweeten food, it sweetened the very air. It was the glow in the evening, the warmth in winter, the perfume of the season's gentler side. And though it was slow to make, slow to gather and slow to pour, perhaps that was the point. In a world ruled by haste and hunger, honey taught patience, it taught gratitude, it taught sweetness that stayed. a small jar on a high shelf, a treasure, a promise that even among hardship there was still beauty, and it made people smile. The kind of smile that came not from plenty, but from the joy of having just enough. Next to honey, perhaps the most unassuming but essential ingredient in medieval kitchens was the onion. It was not glamorous, it was not rare, but it was everywhere. Onions were a staple across nearly all levels of medieval society. Grown in gardens both humble and grand, they could be stored for months when properly dried, making them one of the few reliable vegetables throughout the year, especially in the lean, cold stretch between harvests. Peasants used them daily. Sliced into pottage, the thick vegetable stew that fed countless medieval families, onions added both texture and flavour. Mixed with beans, barley or cabbage, they turned a thin broth into a hearty meal. Even when meat was scarce, a stew flavoured with onions and herbs could feel complete. In towns, market stalls sold them in bunches, their green stalks tied together with straw. Housewives carried them home in baskets. Cooks hung them from rafters to dry. Onions could be eaten raw in a pinch, but they were more often stewed, boiled or fried in dripping fat when such luxury was available. The upper classes used onions too, though differently. In noble households, onions flavoured sauces and meat dishes cooked down with wine or vinegar to accompany roast fowl, venison or pork. A common dish among the wealthy was an onion tart, baked in pastry with cheese and eggs, seasoned with herbs like sage or parsley. These recipes were sometimes preserved in manuscript cookbooks written in French or Latin, passed down between aristocratic kitchens. Onions were also used in medicinal remedies. Medieval physicians believed they could cleanse the blood, ward off colds, and relieve headaches. Crushed onion poultices were applied to wounds or sores. In apothecaries and monasteries, they were included in tinctures and herbal treatments, often alongside garlic or leeks. Even monasteries grew them in kitchen gardens, alongside leeks, shallots, and herbs. The monks knew their value not just for flavour, but for their ability to nourish the sick and the poor. And when dried or pickled, onions travelled well. Soldiers, pilgrims, and traders carried them along roads and battlefields. Easy to pack, easy to eat, and far better than travelling hungry. In short, the onion was not a luxury, but it was a necessity. Sharp, simple, and utterly dependable. One of the quiet pillars of medieval food, from the lowest hearth to the highest hall. And where onions went, something salty often followed, something that preserved the taste of the sea even hundreds of miles inland. Salted fish. In a world without refrigeration, salting wasn't just a method, it was survival. Fish once caught were cleaned and packed in layers of salt, then stored in barrels, hung to dry, or smoked near open fires. This preserved them for weeks or even months, making them one of the most important foods of the medieval period, especially for those far from rivers or coasts. Herring was the most common. It was abundant in the North Sea and became a major trade good, shipped in bulk across northern Europe. Cities like Hamburg, Bruges and London thrived on the salted herring trade. Workers along the docks gutted and packed fish by the thousands, sending them to towns and villages where fresh food was scarce. Cod, too, became a staple, especially once fishing expanded to the coasts of Iceland and later Newfoundland. Dried cod, often called stockfish, was so tough it had to be beaten with a mallet and soaked for cooking. But it travelled extremely well, making it a favourite in military supplies, monasteries and inland manors. Even the church shaped the fish trade. With dozens of fast days on the religious calendar, including every Friday, meat was forbidden, but fish was allowed. This meant salted fish became not just a food of necessity, but one of obedience. Monks ate it, nobles ate it, so did labourers and servants. Rich households might serve it with spices and sauces. The poor simply boiled it with grains or cabbage. In coastal towns, fresh fish was still preferable when possible. Smoked eel, shellfish and river trout could be caught and eaten the same day. But inland, salted fish was what people depended on when winter closed the roads and the cellars ran low. It wasn't always pleasant. Salted fish could be hard, overly briny or full of bones. But it filled bellies, and when softened in a pot and flavoured with herbs or vinegar, it could be made satisfying, even sometimes quite good. More importantly, it lasted. In a medieval kitchen where the rhythms of the year ruled every choice, a barrel of salted fish in the corner was more than just food. It was security, the knowledge that no matter the storm or the season, there would be something to eat. From the salt of the sea to the soil of the field, we move now to a quieter, humbler food. No spice, no sweetness, no preserved richness. Just the gentle weight of the land's oldest gift, beans and lentils. These were the true backbone of the medieval diet, especially for peasants and monastic communities. Grown easily in small plots, hardy in harsh conditions and rich in nutrients, beans and lentils were more than just food. They were fuel. In towns and villages, pottage was the standard meal for most people, a thick stew simmered in a single pot over a fire, often left to bubble throughout the day. Into that pot went whatever was available: chopped onion, cabbage, wild herbs, maybe a bit of bacon if luck allowed, but always beans, lentils, peas. These pulses thickened the stew, added protein and turned water into nourishment. In lean times, they were lifesavers. Dried peas and fava beans could be stored for months, requiring nothing but water and time to become a meal again. In monasteries, they featured regularly, easy to grow, cheap to trade, and acceptable on fasting days when meat was forbidden. For the very poor, beans might be eaten alone, boiled and salted, sometimes mashed into a rough paste and spread on coarse bread. For wealthier households, lentils and peas appeared in more refined forms, spiced, pureed, even baked into pies alongside onions or herbs. They were also important in crop rotation. Beans restored nitrogen to the soil, allowing medieval farmers to replenish their fields naturally, making them essential not only to the plate but to the entire food system. And yet, despite their importance, beans and lentils were often seen as lowly. They didn't carry the status of venison, the charm of honey, or the delicacy of cheese. But they were dependable, honest, endlessly adaptable. They filled the bellies of farmhands and friars, children and craftsmen every day in every season. In a world where hunger was always a few bad harvests away, beans and lentils offered quiet stability. They weren't celebrated, but they were trusted. And trust in medieval kitchens was worth more than gold. Beans and lentils were never the stars of the medieval table. They didn't draw praise in poems or merit a feast in their name, but they were always there, in the pot, on the fire, in the fields, working quietly behind the scenes to keep people going. There were many kinds. Fava beans, broad and earthy, were a staple across Europe. Chickpeas, less common in the north, were valued in warmer regions like southern France or parts of Italy and Spain. Lentils, smaller and quicker to cook, were popular where fuel was scarce. And then there were field peas, often dried, stored and simmered back into life when little else remained in the pantry. Preparation was simple but time-consuming. Dried beans needed long soaking, often left in cool water overnight in clay or wooden bowls. They were then boiled in iron pots or cauldrons, usually alongside whatever was on hand: onion, garlic, leeks, bits of stale bread, or strips of cured fat. Sometimes they were mashed with herbs, sometimes left whole, sometimes stirred into barley to thicken a gruel, often seasoned only with salt if salt was affordable. For peasants, these pulses were the meal, hearty, heavy, sometimes monotonous, but filling. In a hard winter or during Lent, a bowl of bean stew could be the only thing standing between survival and sickness. But they weren't just food. Beans were woven into the rhythms of the medieval farming calendar. Sown in spring, harvested in summer, dried in the sun and shelled by hand, often by the whole family sitting together in the fading light. They grew well even in tired soils, and they returned nutrients to the land, allowing farmers to rotate crops without depleting the fields. In the monasteries, lentils and peas appeared on the table with striking regularity. Monks lived by strict dietary codes, often abstaining from meat or dairy. Beans provided the sustenance needed for labour, prayer and silence. In the careful records of abbey kitchens, they appear almost like old friends, reliable, unassuming, always present. And though nobles had other choices, richer foods, meats and imported luxuries, even they consumed beans during fasting days or when travelling. Cooked right with wine, spices or cream, lentils could find their way into the kitchens of castles. No matter who you were, monk, merchant or milkmaid, you ate beans. They were never rare, but they were always necessary. And in the uncertain world of the Middle Ages, necessity often tasted like comfort. After the slow simmer of beans and lentils, our story drifts towards something sweeter, something that hung in the air before it ever touched the tongue. Apples. Not the polished, uniform kind you might find in a modern grocery stall, but crooked, knobbly things, tart, fragrant, sometimes speckled or misshapen. Apples in the Middle Ages were as varied as the regions that grew them. Some were crisp and bright, perfect for eating fresh from the tree. Others were soft and sharp, best suited for baking, stewing or pressing into cider. Orchards dotted the landscape, especially around monasteries and manor houses. They weren't always large, but they were cherished. In many villages, the apple harvest was a community event. Families climbed ladders, carried baskets and sorted their haul by use, some to store, some to cook and many to drink. Because cider, more than anything, made the apple valuable. Fermented apple juice was safer to drink than much of the water supply, and unlike grape wine, it could be produced in cooler climates. Even children drank weak cider, called small cider, while adults enjoyed stronger brews at taverns and feasts. In places like Normandy and southern England, cider became not just a drink, but a way of life. Cooked apples, too, found their place in the medieval kitchen. Stewed with honey and spices, they became filling for pies and tarts, especially during feast days when sugar, rare and costly, might be borrowed from the pantry. Dried slices were packed for winter or long journeys. Mashed apples were stirred into porridge, blended into sauces for pork, or used to sweeten otherwise bland breads and cakes. They were also a symbol of fertility, temptation, wisdom, depending on who told the story. Carved into woodwork, painted in manuscripts, gifted between lovers, left at altars. The apple's place in the medieval world was as much spiritual as it was culinary. Rich or poor, man or woman, priest or ploughman, everyone knew the apple. Its crunch, its scent, its sweetness when little else was sweet. And in that, it offered more than taste. It offered delight. Apples were one of the most widely cultivated fruits in medieval Europe. Hardy, adaptable, and long-lasting when stored properly, they were a staple in both peasant and noble diets. But not all apples were created equal. Some varieties were sharp and biting, better for cooking than for eating raw. Others were mealy but sweet, perfect for pressing into juice. And a few, rare and treasured, were crisp enough to be enjoyed fresh off the branch. In country villages, people often had a tree or two growing near their homes, even if they didn't own land. These small family orchards were carefully watched as the year turned. Apple blossoms in spring were a sign of hope. By autumn, ripe fruit was gathered with care, wrapped in straw, and stored in cellars or cool, shaded corners to last through the leaner months. Preservation was everything. Apples could be sliced and dried, strung up in kitchens to hang like garlands. Dried apple rings might be soaked in hot water during winter to revive their flavour, or stirred into stews for a touch of acidity. They were sometimes packed into barrels with layers of straw or brine to keep them edible for longer stretches of cold. Cider, as mentioned before, was among the most common uses. It was simple to make. Press the apples, ferment the juice, and store it in wooden barrels. Every region had its own traditions. In England, cider was often part of the farmhand's pay. In parts of France, it was consumed more widely than ale. Some ciders were sharp and brisk, others sweet and heady, but nearly all were safer to drink than river or well water, especially in towns where runoff made clean water a risk. Even in monasteries, apples were valued. Many monks kept careful orchard records, grafting new varieties and experimenting with cultivation. Some medieval gardens list dozens of different apple types. Early harvesters, winter keepers, sweet cookers, each suited to a specific use or season. Apples also appeared in symbol and story. In religious texts, they became metaphors for temptation, knowledge, and even resurrection. In folk tales, they were enchanted, red and round, sometimes poisoned, sometimes healing. But in the end, they were most often food. Simple, familiar, cherished. And in a world of hunger and hardship, the humble apple carried within it something golden, the taste of time and care, and a little sweetness amid the struggle. And when the apples were gone, stored away or stewed into memory, the tankards came out. Ale, not the kind you find bottled in tidy rows or poured frothy in polished taverns. No, medieval ale was a different creature entirely. Murky, warm and uncarbonated, it was more sustenance than indulgence. In many places it was a daily necessity. Water, especially in towns and growing cities, was risky. Contamination from gutters, waste pits, and tanneries made drinking from rivers or wells a gamble. Ale, brewed through boiling and fermentation, was safer. It wasn't just a drink, it was a source of calories, nutrition, and even hygiene. Everyone drank it. Children sipped small ale with barely any alcohol. Labourers guzzled stronger batches to dull the ache of long days. Monks brewed their own in cloistered stillness, and even nuns kept careful brewing records. It wasn't always consistent. Brewing was often done at home, especially by women. The alewife was a fixture in many villages, a woman with a skill for coaxing flavour and strength from malted barley, water and herbs. These women sold pints from their doorsteps or supplied local taverns. Their ale varied by season, by grain, by the feel of the fire and the mood of the yeast. Before hops became common in England, they arrived from the continent later and weren't widely used until the 15th century, brewers flavoured ale with a mix called groot, a blend of herbs like yarrow, mugwort and sweet gale. These herbs not only masked off flavours, but added their own medicinal or intoxicating effects. The result was unpredictable. Some brews light and floral, others thick and bitter. Ale was so integral that many households brewed it themselves. In monasteries it was served 3 times a day, its strength adjusted depending on the meal and the occasion. During Lent or other fasts, ale helped compensate for the lack of solid food. In towns, taverns were often little more than alehouses, a barrel, a bench and a warm fire. And when a feast was held, when meat was carved and music played, ale flowed as freely as stories, sometimes warm, sometimes sour, always familiar. In rural villages, brewing was a domestic chore like baking bread or churning butter. Most women knew how to make it. Recipes weren't written down but passed from hand to hand, flavoured by experience and what the household had on hand. A good alewife could bring in extra income for her family by selling to neighbours, though she might also face a scolding or a fine from local officials if her brew was too weak, too expensive, or if she failed to mark her house with the official ale stake. A long wooden pole hung outside the door when fresh ale was ready. In towns, alehouses became gathering places. More than just places to drink, they were spaces of conversation, celebration, news, and even conflict. Weddings, wakes, hiring fairs, all soaked in ale. And while we think of beer and ale as being for adults, it's important to remember that small ale, weak in alcohol but rich in calories, was consumed by children, the elderly, and workers alike. A midday break from fieldwork might mean a chunk of bread and a cup of small ale, enough to nourish, hydrate, and carry on. In monasteries and noble households, brewing took on an even larger scale. Monks recorded their brewing quantities with meticulous care. Some abbeys brewed thousands of gallons a year to serve monks, guests, and the poor who came seeking alms. In noble estates, brewhouses were permanent fixtures, staffed by servants and specialists. Larger households might have separate brews for different ranks: strong ale for the lord, light ale for the kitchen hands. By the late Middle Ages, beer, a close cousin of ale, brewed with hops, began making its way into England from the Low Countries. Hopped beer lasted longer, travelled better, and had a sharper taste. It gradually replaced traditional unhopped ale in many regions, but not without resistance. Ale had centuries of history behind it. To many, it tasted like home. Few meats were more deeply woven into daily life, especially for those who could not afford venison or other prestigious game. Pigs, unlike cattle, didn't require lush pastures or constant tending. They could eat scraps, root through forest litter, and fatten on whatever the household had left behind. In that sense, they were perfectly suited to medieval life, adaptable, inexpensive, and remarkably efficient. In towns, pigs often roamed freely through alleys and market lanes, they snuffling at refuse and sometimes earning the ire of authorities. But in the countryside, they were prized. A peasant family might raise a pig or two for slaughter in the colder months. Every part of the animal was used, everything but the squeal, as the saying went. Fresh pork was a luxury, best enjoyed in the days immediately after slaughter, before preservation was necessary. It might be roasted on a spit or chopped into stews. But far more often, pork was salted, smoked, or dried. Salt pork was a staple of winter stores. Smoked hams hung from rafters in the kitchen. Sausages were made with seasoned scraps and intestines, then preserved for later use. Bacon, not quite like the crispy strips we know today, was highly valued. It was fatty, flavourful and essential for cooking. A bit of bacon could grease a pan, flavour a porridge or bring life to an otherwise bland pot of vegetables and beans. Even the pig's blood was used, mixed with oats to make black pudding, a filling food eaten by peasants and nobles alike, depending on the spices and cuts involved. And let's not forget the lard, rendered fat used for frying, baking and greasing. In noble households, pork dishes might appear more refined, spiced, marinated or stuffed with herbs. Boar's head, dressed in gilded apples and sprigs of rosemary, was a centrepiece at Christmas feasts. But in more humble homes, pork's presence was quieter. A handful of chopped meat in a pottage, a thin strip beside some peas, a bit of fat saved for the next day's cooking. Pork was not glamorous, but it was trusted, and in a world where meals could never be taken for granted, trust was half the feast. There was a love also for the sweet stuff. Golden, sticky and slow to spoil, it was the medieval world's sweetest gift, and for centuries it was the only real sweetener most people knew. Sugar, imported from distant lands, was too expensive for anyone but the nobility and the wealthiest of merchants. But honey, made by bees that worked the same meadows and orchards where peasants toiled, was accessible, though still precious. It wasn't poured liberally, but saved, cherished and used with care. Villages often kept skep hives, dome-shaped baskets woven from straw or wicker, housing busy colonies. Beekeeping was part of rural life, though it required skill and care. Harvesting honey often meant disturbing the hive and in some cases even destroying it. Protective suits didn't exist, so a beekeeper's success depended on knowing the rhythms of the hive, approaching at the right time and handling the bees with patience. Those who mastered it were respected and well rewarded. The honey they collected wasn't just for drizzling on bread or sweetening a pot of oats. It was stirred into spiced wine, mixed with herbs for medicines, and baked into honey cakes at festival times. In monasteries, honey often flavoured medicinal syrups and healing tonics, sometimes combined with vinegar or crushed herbs. And then there was mead, the honey wine of old, brewed from honey, water and sometimes spices. It was ancient by the time of the Middle Ages, and though not as common as ale or cider, it was drunk at celebrations and ceremonies. A goblet of mead might pass between newlyweds or mark a holy feast. In noble halls, honey might coat roasted meats, adding a rich, sticky glaze, often paired with cloves or cinnamon. It might also appear in elaborate marchpane, early marzipan desserts, shaped into animals or castles, then painted and gilded with gold leaf. But for the average household, honey was seasonal and saved, a sweet preserved for birthdays, weddings, or the rare afternoon when a small piece of honeycomb was passed around to children. Its waxy crunch, a novelty, its sweetness a small wonder. And when the bees quieted for winter, their hives bundled against the cold, the honey sat in earthen jars, waiting for the next moment joy needed a spoonful. Cabbage was a constant. It didn't matter if you were kneeling in a field behind a cottage or standing in the bustling kitchens of a castle. Cabbage found its way to the pot. It grew well in poor soil, survived the cold, and could be eaten fresh or left to ferment into pungent pickles that kept for months. Shredded into pottage, boiled with a bit of bacon, or tucked between bread and cheese, cabbage filled empty bellies with something warm and green, a taste of the earth itself. But cabbage had another trick. It lingered. Not just in the pot, but in the air. It was the kind of food you could smell long before you saw it, bubbling in a clay pot on the fire, like the steam rising and curling into wooden rafters. Some monks, it said, swore it warded off illness. Others just hoped it warded off hunger. And where there was cabbage, leeks were never far behind. Long, slender and softly pungent, leeks were beloved in medieval gardens. Easier to grow than onions and gentler on the stomach, they were used to flavour nearly everything, from meat pies to broth. A good leek could elevate the blandest bowl of peas or beans, and a handful tossed into a boiling pot gave depth that even the poorest household could afford. Leeks were treasured in spring, when winter stores ran low and green things were rare. They were among the first plants to push through thawed soil, hopeful little stalks promising that the hard season was nearly done. In Wales, they were even worn in hats on feast days, a sign of pride in both land and larder. Then there were turnips, unassuming, knobby and dependable. They were the kind of root that didn't mind being forgotten in the ground a little too long. They stored well, boiled quickly, and filled the pot with something thick and mild. Sliced, mashed, or stewed, turnips were a staple of the cold months. Their greens were cooked too, wilted into soups and porridges, or sautéed beside bits of pork if one was lucky. They weren't glamorous, but they were trustworthy. And in a time when trust was scarce, that meant everything. Next to the pot of pottage, you might also find one of the most essential ingredients of all. Not a vegetable, but a pulse. Beans. They weren't flashy. They didn't perfume the room like herbs or sizzle like meat. But beans were the backbone of the medieval diet, especially for those who worked the land and counted their pennies in handfuls of grain. Broad beans, fava beans, fat, dry and dull-coloured, were soaked, stewed, mashed and mixed into pottages, baked into pies, or boiled into thick, pasty meals that stuck to the ribs. They were humble, yes, but they were filling. A bowl of beans, especially when joined by barley or rye bread, made for a complete meal, one that could carry a labourer from dawn to dusk. They were planted in spring, harvested in late summer, and dried carefully to last through the winter. In monasteries, beans were essential, a rich source of protein for monks who abstained from meat. In village homes, they were practical, affordable, storable, and versatile, and in hard times, they were a godsend. Cooked slowly in clay pots, sometimes with a spoonful of lard or a clove of garlic if one had it, they took on a richness beyond their nature. Children grew up on beans, widows relied on them. Whole communities turned to them when fields failed or meat was scarce. But beans, like most foods in the Middle Ages, came with stories. Some said they caused wind, an unfortunate side effect in tightly packed cottages. Others, especially in southern Europe, avoided them on holy days, fearing they stirred the blood too much. But most simply gave thanks that they had them. And when the beans ran low, or when spring arrived with fresh promises, people looked to another favourite from field and garden alike: peas. Small, green and sweet when young, hearty and starchy when dry. Like beans, they were boiled, mashed or made into thick green mush. But fresh peas, when in season, were a treat. Something light, something bright. A sign that the year was turning, and not every meal had to be brown and heavy. Peas were food for the poor and the pious, but also a touch of pleasure. And in a world ruled by rhythm of harvest, hunger, heat and hope, a handful of tender peas was as close to a miracle as spring could offer. Let's stay in that kitchen a little longer. The fire still burns, and beside the pot of peas and beans, there's something sharp and fragrant waiting to be crushed. It hung in plates above the hearth, twisted with twine, drying slowly beside onions and herbs. Sharp, strong and unmistakable. Garlic was the flavour of necessity, the friend of bland pottage and boiled roots, and the quiet secret behind the best stew in the village. In the medieval world, garlic was more than just seasoning. It was medicine too. People believed it chased away sickness, warded off bad airs, as they called them. A clove mashed and stirred into broth was said to strengthen the weak. A bulb tucked under a bed might repel evil spirits or bad dreams. It was a food of superstition and survival, simple and powerful. Farmers grew it in kitchen gardens and along fence lines. Monks tended it in monastery plots, using it in their herb-based remedies and Lenten meals. Even lords, though they might wrinkle their noses at its pungency, ate it masked in sauces or baked into meat pies. When raw, it bit the tongue, but when roasted slowly in embers or simmered in stew, it softened into something sweet, mellow, earthy. A clove crushed into bread dough, tucked inside a pie, or stirred into beans could transform the plainest meal into something memorable. And in the cold months, when colds and coughs made the rounds, garlic was crushed with honey, heated with wine, and taken like a cure. Not always effective, but comforting nonetheless. Garlic gave depth to dishes that lacked meat, warmth to meals made from stored roots, and a little bit of edge to otherwise gentle foods like peas and leeks. It didn't cost much, and it grew almost anywhere, which is why it ended up in nearly everything. Even the humblest traveller's soup, simmered in a borrowed pot over a borrowed fire, likely carried the scent of garlic. And when the pot was taken from the flame and the bread was broken, and the last light of day faded from the rafters, garlic lingered, in the breath, in the warmth, in the memory of something rich, even when the cupboard was bare. But garlic, of course, was just one thread in the great tapestry of medieval meals. Now let's open the shutters just a little and step into the garden, where onions grew fat and golden beneath the soil. In the Middle Ages, you were what you ate. And what you ate was bound tightly to who you were. Not just in name or title, but in station, in land, in what your hands could reach and your coin could command. For peasants, meals were local, seasonal and functional. You ate what the land could give and what you had the strength to grow. In spring, there might be wild greens and leeks. In summer, fresh peas and berries. In autumn, root vegetables and barley. And in winter, dried beans, sour bread and pickled cabbage if you were lucky. Meat was rare, often a luxury, and more often replaced by salted fish or lard. Eggs came when hens laid. Milk came when the cow cooperated. Most meals were built around what could be stretched: grains, legumes, scraps, and almost everything passed through the pottage pot. The great cauldron over the fire that never quite emptied, just changed its flavour day by day as new scraps were added and old ones faded. Peasant food wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to last. But nobles, seated at carved tables beneath vaulted ceilings, lived a different sort of life. Their food was display, their plates were theatre. At great feasts, roasted swans wore their own feathers again. Peacocks were gilded and served whole. Spiced wine flowed like rivers, and courses arrived in waves. Meat, fish, pastries, fruits, all dressed in colours and sauces from far-off lands. They had access to imported spices like cinnamon, cloves and pepper. They could afford sugar, almonds and citrus, rare treasures carried over mountains or oceans. Their breads were white and fine. Their pies were stuffed with partridge, eel or dates. Even their vegetables were chosen for novelty: purple carrots, sweet parsnips, tender greens. It wasn't just taste, it was power. To eat things no one else could afford was to remind the room, I am above you. And if that reminder wasn't clear enough, the sumptuary laws made it law. These were rules that dictated who could wear what fabrics, who could serve which meats, and who could dine on which birds or pastries. A merchant who dressed too richly or ate too finely might be fined. A peasant caught hunting a noble's deer could lose his hand or worse. Because food wasn't just nourishment, it was hierarchy, it was identity, it was proof. And in a world where everything could be taken, your land, your freedom, even your life, the act of eating well was a kind of declaration. I matter. I belong. I rule. But while the nobles dined in stone halls and peasants crouched by hearths, there were places where food brought people together, even if only briefly. Yet even within the quiet of that divide, between manor and meadow, castle and cottage, the line between peasant and noble was drawn most clearly at the table. For the peasant, meals were not moments of celebration, but rituals of survival. A crust of rye bread, dry and tough, softened with a ladle of broth. A turnip sliced into a bubbling stew that had no meat, only the memory of it. A cabbage boiled again and again, until even its bitterness seemed humble. They cooked with what the land gave them. Oats, barley and rye were ground into coarse flour and baked into dense loaves. Beans were soaked overnight, then cooked in heavy pots, with perhaps alongside scraps of salted pork if fortune had smiled. Garlic and onions lent flavour where flavour was otherwise absent. And when winter crept in and stores ran low, people turned to pickled roots, dried apples, and whatever might still be clinging to the cellar walls. Most meals were taken in silence or with murmured prayer. The table was often shared by family and livestock alike, in homes where smoke clung to rafters and warmth was bartered with every log. But for the noble class, food was spectacle. To eat was to display one's wealth, breeding and reach. Meals were arranged in courses, not just for pleasure, but for status. The more exotic the dish, the more distant the spice, the more labour required to carve or prepare it, the more refined the diner. A nobleman's table might feature roasted boar, stuffed with songbirds, fish moulded into elaborate shapes, jellied meats dyed with saffron, or even pies that revealed live doves upon cutting. Silver platters and goblets gleamed beneath chandeliers. The meal was not merely sustenance, it was a performance of power. But this extravagance came with rules. The sumptuary laws, enforced especially in later centuries, dictated who could eat venison, who could serve sugar sculptures, and who could dare to wear purple silk while doing so. A rich merchant could afford a peacock, but unless he held noble rank, He could not legally serve it at a feast. Such was the order of things. You ate what your place allowed, and to eat beyond your means was to challenge the world as it stood. Still, in both cottage and castle, there were moments that softened the lines. Feast days, weddings, harvest festivals. Times when the village roasted a pig, and even the poorest child might hold a dripping bone. When bread was shared freely, ale poured wide, and songs filled the space where hierarchy usually sat. But these were rare. Most days a peasant's belly grumbled beneath a cloak patched 3 times, and most nights a noble dined by candlelight with a plate full of finery and a servant at his elbow. The food told the story. The feast. It began before sunrise. In the village, the smell of smoke curled from chimney tops. Bread dough was already rising beside hearths, and cauldrons of beans and barley bubbled over small fires. In the manor, servants moved swiftly, polishing platters, fetching wine from cellars, and plucking the feathers from fowl that had been hung to tenderize in the cool of the larder. Feast days, often tied to the church calendar or a noble wedding, were rare, sacred, and cherished. For peasants, it might be the only day of the year they tasted fresh meat. For nobles, it was a chance to display not just wealth, but magnanimity, the image of generosity, even if hunger lingered outside the castle gates the very next morning. In the field, a pig was turned on a spit, fat sizzling into the flame. Nearby, baskets overflowed with bread, trenchers mostly, the thick, stale kind, used as edible plates, later tossed to the poor or fed to pigs. Cabbages were chopped, leeks diced, and dried apples stewed into fragrant compotes. Children chased each other through the village, the air alive with music and clatter. Ale flowed from barrels, drawn into wooden mugs. Even the oldest among them, faces lined like parchment, smiled through missing teeth. It was a day to eat until full, a feeling not easily remembered in thin seasons. Inside the Lord's Hall, the atmosphere was different, lavish, controlled. The feast followed a rhythm, 3 courses, sometimes 5, sometimes more. It began with light fare, soups, salads, soft cheese, sweetmeats. Then came the roasted meats, venison, capon, pheasant, or, if the Lord was especially proud, a boar's head carried in with a flourish. Each dish carefully spiced, arranged and presented. Dancers performed. A jester might leap past the table, balancing pies or cups upon his head. Between courses wine was poured and fingers wiped upon fine linen cloths. And all the while the food kept coming. Stews rich with marrow, pastries stuffed with fruit, tarts glazed with honey, and butter poached fish set atop beds of herbs. It was a performance as much as a meal. And while the Lord's table glittered with silver and song, the villagers sat on rough-hewn benches in the courtyard below, eating from bowls, laughing louder, drinking deeper. For this one day they were fed. For this one day the world tasted sweet. And as the sun dipped behind the thatched roofs and torchlight replaced the sky, bellies full and feet sore from dancing, people lay down beneath the stars and dreamed of roast meat, of warm bread, of honey on their tongues, even if tomorrow brought only gruel. The medieval kitchen was not a tidy, tiled place with polished counters and humming appliances. It was a hearth, a flame in the centre of a room, or a long fire built along the back wall of a manor kitchen. Smoke clung to the rafters like old memories. Ash softened the floor. Heat pulsed through stone and timber. In small cottages, the kitchen was the house. A single fire used for warmth, light, and food alike. Pots hung from hooks or rested on tripods. Bread was baked in clay ovens or under heavy lids covered in coals. There were no thermostats, no dials, only instinct and years of watching a mother stir thick pottage with a wooden spoon as long as your arm. For the peasantry, cooking tools were simple. A large cauldron for soup and stew, a pan for frying, a board for chopping, a knife passed from hand to hand. The ingredients changed with the seasons, but the method rarely did. Boil it, stew it, stretch it. A single pot of lentils and barley might feed a family for 3 days, warmed and rewarmed as needed. In wealthier households, the scene looked different, though not always cleaner. Castle kitchens were bustling, chaotic places full of motion and smoke. Multiple fires burned at once. Meat turned on great spits, powered sometimes by dogs in treadmills or small boys turning cranks for hours. Large cauldrons simmered with game and wine. Pastries were stuffed and glazed. Herbs, thyme, sage, parsley were chopped fresh and thrown into boiling pots by hand. They used tools made of iron and wood, mortar and pestle for grinding spice, skewers for meat, huge ladles, tongues and strainers. In some kitchens, whole teams of cooks worked in shifts, one for the meats, one for sauces, one for desserts. Water had to be fetched from wells or carried from streams. Fires had to be built fresh each morning. Everything took longer, everything was harder, but still they cooked, and still they sat down together at the end of the day. Whether peasant or noble, family or servant, food bound them, not just in what they ate, but how they made it, how they waited, how they watched, how they passed recipes by word and by hand, by memory and by mouth. The food on a medieval table did not appear by magic. It was earned by sun and soil, sweat and callus, risk and routine. It was the outcome of every day's labour, shaped by the seasons and the limits of land, and before it could be cooked, it had to be found. In the countryside, fields stretched like patchwork, oats, rye, barley and wheat rippling in the wind. Villagers rose with the sun to sow and reap, to dig and scatter seed, to bend low with aching backs and hands chapped by cold. What they grew was what they ate, and what they couldn't grow, they foraged. Nettles for soup, wild garlic in spring, mushrooms from the shaded woods, but only the kind grandmother said were safe. Berries and nuts in late summer, apples shaken down from crooked trees, chickens for eggs if they were lucky, a pig fattened slowly for slaughter come autumn. If times were good, the food was simple but steady. If times were hard, roots and bark became soup. Hunting was a different story. For peasants it was dangerous, not because of the beasts, but because of the law. In much of Europe, hunting game in the king's forest or a noble's land was a crime. Caught poaching, you might lose your hand or your life. But hunger doesn't care for borders, so snares were set in secret, rabbits caught at dusk, birds brought down with slings, the woods fed the brave and sometimes the desperate. For the nobility, hunting was a pastime and a privilege, a sport performed on horseback with hounds and horns with falcons and feasts to follow, venison, boar, hare, not just food but trophies. These animals fed the castle, yes, but they also fed pride. There was glory in a good hunt, and a kitchen busy with fresh meat was a sign of wealth that could be heard even through closed gates. But not all food came from the land. Along trade routes, winding, treacherous and long, came dried fruits, sacks of spice, salted fish, almonds, sugar, oil. A cloth merchant might carry figs from Italy. A pilgrim could return with saffron tucked in a pouch. And in the great cities, market stalls overflowed with goods the local earth could not give. Each bite, each morsel told a story of where it came from and how far it had travelled to reach the hand that ate it. Because even in the Middle Ages, food moved, and so did the people. And now, perhaps we'll visit where they ate it. Not just the kitchens or fields, but the tables, the festivals, the moments when meals became memory. Food was not only sustenance, it was ritual, a rhythm, a moment of pause between the labours of day and the silence of night. And where one ate, how one sat, what one used, who one dined beside, was as much a mark of class and culture as the food itself. For most peasants, meals were taken near the hearth, often on stools or benches, with no table at all. A rough wooden board laid across barrels, or the family lap served well enough. There were no plates, not as we know them, just trenchers, which were stale rounds of bread used as makeshift dishes. You'd eat your pottage, your stew, your bits of onion or cheese, and then, if hunger still lingered, the trencher itself. Spoons were shared, fingers were common, a knife, if you had one, doubled as a tool and utensil. They ate quickly, out of necessity. There was always more to do, more to till, more to mend, more to carry. But still, a hot meal at dusk was a kind of peace. Children curled beside the fire. Steam from the pot rose like incense, a crust of bread passed from hand to hand. It wasn't elegant, but it was enough. In castles and manor houses, the scene was different and deliberate. Great halls were lined with long tables. Lords sat at the high end, their guests ranked by importance. Nobles did not eat in solitude. Meals were performances, occasions to display wealth, generosity and refinement. There were multiple courses, dishes decorated with herbs or gold leaf, meats shaped into mythical creatures, sugar spun into towers. Musicians played as food was served. Servants stood ready with jugs of wine or trenchers fresh from the kitchen. Yet even here, things were not always so clean. People still used their hands. Bones were tossed to the dogs beneath the table. spills were frequent, and napkins were rare. The difference was ceremony, not hygiene. It was the feeling of luxury that separated the manor from the cottage, more than the tools or techniques. And then there were festivals. The church calendar governed the year, and with it came feasts: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, Saints' Days, harvest time. These were the rare days when the poor might eat a bit better: a slice of meat, a honeyed cake, a warm drink. Villages gathered in barns or fields. Fires burned long into the night. Laughter carried down the lanes. For a moment food became joy, because whether rich or poor, alone or among many, to eat was to live, and to eat together was to remember what that meant. Time, for medieval people, was not kept by clocks, but by light, by labour, and by bells. The rhythm of eating followed the rhythm of work, and the seasons whispered what was possible. In most households there were 2 meals a day. Breakfast, as we know it, was rare. The first true meal, known simply as dinner, came late in the morning, once the morning's labour had already begun to drain the body. This was a filling meal: pottage thick with beans or greens, bread dipped in broth, perhaps some cold meat if one had it, or boiled eggs with herbs from the garden. Supper came in the evening, just before dusk, lighter, humbler, often made from the leftovers of the earlier meal: a bit of cheese, a crust of bread, a stew that had simmered all day by the fire. For the poor, it was whatever could be spared. For the rich, it was another occasion to gather and display. But the true calendar of eating was ruled by the seasons. Spring brought greens, nettles, cress, leeks, and the promise of planting. Eggs were more plentiful as hens began to lay again. In summer, gardens swelled with peas and beans. Fruits like cherries and apples began to ripen, and milk was fresh and sweet. Autumn was the season of abundance. The harvest came. Grains were gathered, pigs were slaughtered and salted. Nuts and apples were dried, vegetables were preserved. The barns filled, and for a while, bellies did too. Winter was a test. Bread from the last of the stored grain, salted meat if you were lucky, porridge stretched with scraps. On the coldest nights, hunger bit at the edges. Root vegetables and smoked fish filled the pot. Dried peas boiled slowly to softness. Every meal was survival. And then came Lent, the great fasting season before Easter. Meat was forbidden. Dairy too, in theory. Fish, especially salted herring or eel, became a staple. For the devout and the dutiful, it was a time of reflection. For the poor, it was much like every other month. Meals were shaped not only by appetite, but by faith, by land, by light, and by what could be kept, caught, or given. The table changed with the year, and in its quiet rhythm, from feast to famine, from planting to plucking, the Middle Ages moved. The medieval kitchen, whether in a peasant's cottage or a nobleman's castle, was a place of smoke, sweat, and skill. There were no gleaming stoves, no ovens with knobs or timers. There was fire, and what you could do with it. For the peasant, cooking meant the hearth, a shallow pit, sometimes ringed with stones where firewood cracked and coals glowed. An iron pot might hang from a chain or rest directly in the embers. Everything went in the same pot: onions, turnips, lentils, maybe a shred of bacon. It simmered all day, thickening into pottage, the staple of the poor. Stirred with a wooden spoon, seasoned with salt if you had it, served with bread if you were fortunate. There were no countertops. Herbs were chopped on a board, grain ground in a quernstone by hand. Dried beans were soaked overnight, sometimes for days. A meal took time, and time was something the poor learned to stretch. In castles and monasteries, kitchens were larger, but not necessarily cleaner. Fires roared in stone hearths wide enough to roast entire animals. Spits turned slowly, sometimes by hand, sometimes by small dogs running inside a wheel like a furry treadmill. Cooks worked in layers, the scullions fetching water or gutting fish, the cook himself stirring sauces thick with imported spices, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, for the Lord's feast. There were bakehouses too, bread ovens made of clay or stone, heated with fire, then swept clean so loaves could be placed inside to bake in the residual heat. Some villages shared these ovens, each family waiting their turn, marked dough ready in hand. Pots were made of iron, sometimes ceramic. Utensils were simple: wooden spoons, iron knives, sometimes a ladle carved from bone. Food was smoked, dried, salted, or pickled to make it last. Ale brewed in barrels, cheese aged on wooden shelves. Butter churned by hand. Preparation was labour. Eating was rest. And yet, amid the labour, the ash-streaked hands and the boiling pots, there was something beautiful, something universal. The careful rhythm of transforming raw things into warmth, into comfort, into the quiet fullness of a shared meal. In even the humblest home, the hearth was sacred, not only for warmth but for sustenance. A mother might rise before the first light, her breath blooming in the chill to tend the fire, a spark coaxed to life with patience and kindling. If the fire had died in the night, a common dread, it might mean no hot meal that day unless a neighbour could spare a coal. For peasants, cooking meant improvisation, a blackened pot passed down through generations, never truly empty, only refilled. Its walls were seasoned not by spices but by memory. What went in depended on what the garden gave, what the hens laid, or what could be foraged from the woods nearby. Mushrooms, herbs, nuts, berries. There was no recipe, there was only instinct. A bit of this, a handful of that. A pinch when there was enough to pinch. Water was drawn from the village well, firewood gathered or purchased, and time, long slow time, was the main ingredient. The rich, of course, had more to work with. Great kitchens hummed with staff, cooks, assistants, bakers, butchers, spitboys, pastry makers, and the food they made was not just to nourish, it was to dazzle. Peacocks redressed in their own feathers, swans glazed with spices and presented whole, jellied meats, golden pastries, dishes tinted with saffron or crushed herbs for colour. But behind the glamour, even those kitchens were places of hard labour. Scullions scrubbed pans and swept floors, water had to be hauled, fires constantly fed, and meat, it came on the hoof, slaughtered in the courtyard, bled, butchered, salted, if not eaten fresh. In both cottage and castle, meat was preserved for winter, smoked in huts with smouldering wood, halted and hung from beams. Cheese was wrapped in cloth and pressed. Apples laid out to dry. Beans strung like garlands along the rafters. There were no fridges, no freezers, no supermarkets to rescue a forgotten meal. Food had to last. Waste was not an option. And yet, from such humble tools and unpredictable ingredients came meals that comforted, that restored, that gathered people to the same low table or around the same roaring hearth. Because no matter the size of the fire, the shape of the pot, or the coarseness of the bread, the kitchen was always the centre, the beginning of the story, the warmth behind the hunger. And from there, we move now to the moments when food became more than fuel, when it became celebration, ritual, gathering. A shared meal was an act of fellowship, whether beneath the vaulted ceilings of a noble's great hall or under the timber beams of a peasant's cottage. It was where stories were traded, where songs took root, where silence between bites spoke of trust, of kinship. For the peasants, most meals were quiet and practical, a bowl of pottage, a scrap of bread, perhaps a bit of pickled fish or cheese. But even the poorest homes found occasion to gather, a wedding, a harvest, a saint's feast day. Then the rough table was laid with more care. Ale flowed freely, loaves were torn and passed, and if someone had managed to catch a hare or roast a chicken, it became the centrepiece, not of the meal, but of the moment. They sat on benches or stools, eating from shared trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as plates soaked through with meat and broth. Children sat low on rush-covered floors, dipping crusts into stews. The air smelled of herbs, wood smoke, and baked apples when they were lucky, and always, always, there was chatter, laughter, even in lean years. The nobility, by contrast, turned meals into theatre. Feasts were orchestrated events, expressions of wealth, status, and spectacle. Dozens of dishes, each more elaborate than the last, roast boar with gilded tusks, pies hiding live birds, courses served with fanfare and music. Food was displayed, not just served, and much of it was not eaten, a show of abundance that bordered on excess. Meals took hours, etiquette was strict, guests washed hands in scented basins before dining. Dishes were carved at the table, sauces announced like poetry. But underneath the pomp, the same human need stirred, the need to gather, to eat, to share. In monasteries, meals were silent, monks seated side by side, listening to scripture as they ate simple fare, bread, fish, beans. But the reverence remained. The awareness that food was more than nourishment, it was grace. In every corner of the medieval world, food was tied to rhythm, of the day, of the season, of the sacred calendar. Easter brought lamb. Lent took meat away. Harvest festivals overflowed. Winter was lean and hungry. Spring brought greens, summer, berries, autumn, abundance. To eat together was to live together. In the early morning mist, long before the roosters crowed, peasants were already walking the rows of their fields, wooden hoes over shoulders, hands calloused from yesterday's labour. For most medieval people, food didn't come from a shop or market. It came from the earth itself, and only if the season was kind. Grain was the backbone: barley, rye, oats and wheat. Grown in narrow strips on manorial lands or small family plots, it demanded constant care. Rain too early and it rotted, sun too long and it withered. The harvest was a gamble every year, but when it came in, golden, dusty, piled in sheaves, there was relief. Flour for bread, mash for ale, straw for bedding. Every stalk mattered. Vegetables came from gardens tucked behind cottages or between buildings. Leeks, onions, cabbages, beans. Herbs grew in windowsills or monastery plots: thyme, parsley, sage, used more for health than flavour. And in times of need, people turned to the hedgerows: wild garlic, nettles, dandelion greens, berries. Children knew which mushrooms to pick. Women carried baskets not for beauty, but for berries, nuts and edible leaves. Meat was harder: hunted, trapped, or, more often, not had at all. The forest was both pantry and danger. Boars lurked. Poachers risked their lives for a fat rabbit or a brace of pheasant. Only the nobility could legally hunt deer or hawk game birds. But that didn't stop hungry bellies from trying. A snare, a silent arrow, a well-timed stone, and supper was caught if you were lucky and not seen. Fishermen cast lines into rivers, hauled nets from lakes, and dug eels from the mud. Coastal folk ate oysters, mussels, and dried cod. Inland salted fish made long journeys in barrels, their scent strong enough to announce their arrival long before they were opened. Food was not just cooked, it was earned, with sweat, with planning, with luck, and once gathered it had to be prepared: dried, smoked, pickled, stored. There were no pantries full of packaging, no expiry dates, just a cellar's damp stone, a salted cask, a hanging row of garlic. Preservation wasn't a bonus, it was a necessity. Winter waited, always. And yet, for all the labour, for all the risk, there was pride. In a loaf of bread, round and warm, in a stew that lasted 3 days, in a child fed. Because the story of medieval food wasn't just about what was eaten, but about what it took to get there. To eat in the medieval world was to affirm your place in it. Every bite was part of a story, of who you were, where you came from, and what you had to endure to fill your bowl. Food was survival, yes, but it was also heritage, ritual, and sometimes defiance. The peasant who gathered wild greens and boiled them into a thin pottage wasn't just making dinner. She was repeating generations of knowledge: what was edible, what healed, what could stretch through lean months. A handful of barley in a clay pot wasn't just grain. It was time, soaked, simmered, watched carefully to avoid waste. It was care, not just cooking. In noble courts, where sugar-dusted pastries towered and venison glazed with imported spices was paraded between courses, the food did more than nourish, it performed. It spoke of wealth, alliances, trade routes, and conquest. A single dish could hold a world of meaning: saffron from the east, pepper from distant ships, a sturgeon caught in the King's River, everything carefully chosen, not for hunger, but for power. And yet, in both settings, food still brought people together. Families gathered at dusk, whether around trestle tables or dirt floors. Meals marked life's turning points: births, marriages, funerals. Even famine had its rituals: prayers, fasts, communal meals where the strongest fed the weakest. Food memory was strong. Children remembered the scent of apples drying on a windowsill. Travellers dreamed of the bread from their home village. Monks traced their liturgical year through meals: fish on Fridays, feasting on saints' days, fasting in Lent. Food shaped the calendar and the soul. It was bound up in blessings, in thanks, in superstition. Spilled salt, toss it over your shoulder. First harvest, offer it to the church. A full table in hard times, a miracle. Even hunger carried memory: a winter with no flour, a spring with too much rain, the loss of livestock. These things lived on in how people planted, how they saved, how they told stories. And so, as the fire burns low and your eyes begin to close, remember this: medieval food wasn't just gruel, it was love, labour, knowledge, joy, and sorrow. A story told every day in what they grew, hunted, cooked, and shared. And maybe if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The scrape of a spoon, the hiss of meat on stone, the laughter between bites. And yet not all food choices in the medieval world were left to the whims of land or hunger. Some were dictated by law, sumptuary laws they were called. rules crafted by kings and councils to decide what you could wear, what you could own, and yes, what you could eat. These weren't health regulations or safety concerns. These were declarations of status. Legal walls between classes, built not from stone but from spices and sauces. A merchant, no matter how rich, might be forbidden to serve swan at his daughter's wedding feast. That bird was reserved for nobility. A wealthy widow in town might be fined for laying out too many exotic imports at her table. Ginger, cinnamon, figs from across the sea. Even colours on the tablecloth or silver on the plate could be seen as overstepping. Because food, like fashion, was one of the most visible ways to show wealth, and for those in power, that visibility needed controlling. Sumptuary laws reminded the rich but not noble to stay in their place. They told butchers who they could sell certain cuts of meat to. They limited how many courses could be served at a feast, depending on the host's rank. In some towns, even the size of a bank could draw suspicion. Too much luxury in the wrong house could be seen as a challenge to the social order. These laws were often poorly enforced and even more poorly followed, especially behind closed doors. But their existence reveals just how closely food and identity were tied. To eat richly wasn't just indulgence, it was ambition and sometimes rebellion. So meals were more than nourishment, they were performances. Messages, silent declarations written in roast goose, glazed pastries and wine poured too freely. To sit at a table in the Middle Ages was to take your place in a long, tangled chain of hierarchy and tradition, whether you followed the rules, bent them quietly, or dared to break them, and somewhere beneath it all was still the same simple truth. Food mattered. It was never just gruel, it was always something more. Behind castle walls, yes, a peacock might be served in all its feathered glory, its skin redressed over cooked flesh, jewelled eyes blinking in candlelight. But behind that same castle, in the village where the baker lived and the tanner scraped hides in sour water, things were different. Humble, yes, but no less rich in story. When the law said no venison, the forester's wife might still trade a few eggs for a strip of smoked meat, squirreled away from a poacher's stash, wrapped tight in cloth. If saffron was reserved for noble kitchens, then wild marigold or turmeric root might colour a dish just the same, a poor man's golden feast hidden in plain sight. The people remembered what they weren't supposed to have, and then found their own way toward it. In this way, food became quiet defiance. A way to taste beyond one's rank, to push gently at the ceiling placed overhead. Recipes passed down not in books but in whispered instruction. When to add the rosemary, how to keep onions sweet, how long to soak the bread before roasting it with fat. These weren't just culinary tricks. They were lessons in how to make little into plenty to give dignity to scarcity. And sometimes even nobility played at bending the rules. A baron might hold a feast larger than permitted, blaming the excess on guests who arrived uninvited. A bishop might import sugar-dusted sweets through foreign merchants, too expensive for common eyes, too secret for official rebuke. After all, indulgence has always been a temptation and a language. And so the laws continued century after century, trying to draw boundaries between the full and the hungry, the deserving and the merely aspiring. But food had its own ideas. It moved through alleys and courtyards, over back fences and down market lanes. It slipped past regulation in baskets and bellies, a constant living protest against rigid lines. Because in the end, even in the Middle Ages, a warm meal was still a warm meal, and hunger never cared who wore the crown. Not every dish from the Middle Ages was dull or dreary. Yes, there were stews and porridge and bread, plenty of it. But nestled between the familiar staples were culinary surprises. Strange combinations, rich delicacies, and meals that walked the line between hearty and odd. Recipes passed from kitchens to castles, sometimes strange to modern tastes, but deeply loved by those who stirred them into being. Let's begin with a dish both royal and comforting, blancmanga. Don't let the name fool you, it wasn't bland. This creamy pale dish was made by slowly boiling shredded chicken and rice, then blending it with almond milk and sometimes a touch of sugar or honey. The result? A soft, almost pudding-like creation. Smooth, rich and pale as linen. Nobles adored it. It was considered refined, gentle on the stomach, and perfect for recovering from illness. And with the cost of almonds and sugar, it wasn't something most villagers would ever see, unless they cooked for a noble house. Next came frumenti, a favourite among both peasants and the upper class, depending on how it was dressed. At its core, it was cracked wheat boiled in milk or broth, soft and thick like oatmeal. But from there, it transformed. Peasants might stir in a bit of leftover bacon fat or dried fruit, while nobles might top it with venison or sweet spices. Frumenti sat somewhere between porridge and feast, depending on the purse of the cook, one of the few dishes that truly crossed the social divide. And then lamprey pie. Not for the faint of heart, this royal delicacy was made from a slippery, jawless fish that lived in rivers and estuaries. Difficult to catch and even harder to clean, lampreys were prized by kings and clergy alike. Their rich, earthy flesh was spiced, baked in pies, and served with elaborate sauces, often thick with wine, vinegar, and exotic flavours. It was a statement dish. In fact, kings of England were known to receive lamprey pies as holiday gifts, an edible symbol of loyalty and wealth. And finally, something a little more rustic. Compost. No, not the kind in your garden. This was a medieval pickled salad made from boiled root vegetables like carrots, parsnips and turnips, then soaked in vinegar, wine, honey and spices. Sweet, sour and sharp all at once, it was the closest thing the Middle Ages had to coleslaw. Served cold, often as a side dish at feasts, compost added brightness to tables heavy with roasted meats and dark bread. So yes, medieval food could be strange, but it could also be clever, delicious, even daring. Eating food was one thing, but getting it was another. In medieval life, foraging wasn't a hobby, it was a necessity, especially for peasants and rural dwellers who couldn't always rely on harvests or markets. Before the rise of structured agriculture or consistent trade, people turned to the woods, meadows and hedgerows to find what they needed and what they could stomach. Berries, for example, were prized both for their sweetness and their nutrients. Wild strawberries, blackberries, sloes, elderberries and bilberries were gathered in late summer and early autumn, eaten fresh or dried and stored when possible. Children were often the gatherers, small hands reaching into brambles to collect precious handfuls, often rewarded with purple-stained mouths and scratched arms. Nuts like hazelnuts, acorns and chestnuts were gathered in autumn and could be ground into coarse flour or roasted for food during the lean winter months. In some regions, chestnuts served as a bread substitute, especially in mountainous areas like parts of France and Italy, where wheat was harder to grow. Wild greens and herbs made up the bulk of the forage diet in spring and early summer when gardens had yet to yield crops. Sorrel, nettles, wild garlic, dandelion leaves and chickweed were added to pottages, stews and even medicinal brews. These greens were vital sources of vitamins and minerals when other vegetables were scarce. But foraging also carried risks, particularly with mushrooms. Without today's scientific classification or easy guides, knowledge was passed orally from one generation to the next. One wrong mushroom could mean days of sickness or even death. Fly agaric and death cap mushrooms, for example, were deadly, yet easily mistaken for edible kinds. As such, mushroom foraging was often left to the most experienced elders in the community. Foraging also had legal implications. In feudal systems, land was owned by lords, and technically peasants could be punished for taking from the woods. Still, most lords turned a blind eye to minor foraging, especially if it helped prevent unrest or starvation. Some forests were even designated as common land, where villagers were allowed to collect firewood, graze animals, and forage certain foods. Foraging, in essence, was a deeply seasonal, regional and communal activity, a delicate dance with nature where the year's bounty could make or break the months to come. Though the era is often remembered for its fields and feudal estates, the forest remained a vast living pantry for peasants, travelling merchants and even monks. In a time when agriculture operated on the mercy of weather and spoiling grain meant famine, the wild offered a vital supplement that could mean survival rather than starvation. Each rhythm of the turning seasons carried potential harvests. Summer brought blackberries and elderberries. Autumn offered hazelnuts and chestnuts. Spring delivered nettles and dandelion greens. Mushrooms lurked in damp shadows. People didn't forage for novelty. They foraged to replace, to diversify, to anticipate hardship. For peasants and woodlanders, picking berries was a community affair. As August softened into September, families fanned out with woven baskets, children darting into brambles to hoist tiny clusters of blackberries, their fingers bleeding purple. These berries weren't just a treat, they were utility. Some were eaten fresh, others dried on cloth or smokehouse beams, then stored through winter to sweeten pudding or flavour porridge. Elderberries and bilberries were gathered similarly, often crushed into syrups or mead, providing a mirthful counterpoint to lean grains. In Ireland, archaeological evidence confirms that similar practices stretched back even further, with hazelnuts recognised as essential staples, and possibly even used as a form of barter. Nuts like hazelnuts, acorns, chestnuts, and wild walnuts were another lifeline. Collected in autumn, they were shelled and either roasted or ground into coarse flours. In mountainous or woodland regions, such as parts of France, Italy, or Ireland, chestnut trees grew so abundant that local people relied on them in place of wheat. The nuts were milled into meal that kept through the winter, used for baking or thickening stews, sustaining families when grain stores ran dangerously low. Spring's first greens, nettles, sorrel, chickweed, wild garlic, offered more than flavour. After months of stale bread and salted meat, these sharp, mineral-rich leaves replenished vitamins and iron and provided freshness in a diet too often bland. Village herb women recognised these plants for both food and medicine. Nettles were boiled for soup, sorrel made broth tart, wild garlic brought aroma into otherwise appetite-draining meals. Many of these plants were preserved, dried in bundles, crushed in clay jars, then rehydrated when fresh options became scarce. But the forest also harboured danger, especially among the mushrooms. Without modern guides, people relied entirely on ancestral wisdom. A mistaken mushroom could result in illness or death. Chroniclers and herbalists passed verbal warnings. That red toadstool brings tempests to the mind, referring to the hallucinogenic fly agaric or worse. For this reason, mushroom gathering was often performed by the most experienced elders, the grandmothers, the herbalists, sometimes monks who preserved these oral traditions. The accidental inclusion of deathcap or other toxic fungi could devastate whole families. Folklore attached fairy tales and omens to mushroom rings, warning children away. One must not underestimate the social impact of foraging. These tasks were communal rituals, demonstrations of shared knowledge and local identity. Elders led expeditions. Younger folk learned which plant's leaf indicated ripeness, which bark or root could feed livestock in famine. Tasks were interwoven with the ebb and flow of the medieval calendar. Families gathered tree sap in early spring, not for drinking, but for boiling down sweet syrup. Community forays into hedgerows harvested rose hips prized for vitamin C and elderflowers for tonic teas. At the same time, tangled forest trails became libraries of seasonal signals, ground ivy blooming, satellite mushrooms clustering, marking moments to forage or prepare. Certainly, rigorous medieval agrarian law demanded that foraging be carefully regulated. Feudal rights often restricted general forest access. Peasants technically risked punishment for gleaning under noble control. Yet enforcement was often flexible. Lords turned a blind eye so long as villagers gleaned parsley or nuts to stave off hunger, harmless after a good harvest. Commoners exercised customary rights on forest margins. If fruit or nuts became too tempting, the lord might command a fine, but seldom sought punishment that might drive families away. Regions such as the Irish Mesolithic built rituals around harvesting, the gathering of bilberries at Lugnasa festival or storing hazelnuts underground. These practices persisted into medieval times as markers of continuity between past and present. nwikipedia.org. Similarly, Italian chestnut groves fed entire villages and pressed nuts into oil, a uniquely resilient substitute in wet or mountainous terrain. These practices were signs of adaptation, not lack. Agriculture had limits, the forest had breadth. Even monasteries embraced the forest's yield. Cistercian and Benedictine monks cultivated herb gardens, but also cultivated knowledge carefully, harvesting elderflower for cordials, rose hips for tonics, but also venturing into adjacent woodlands for mushrooms and roots. Their manuscripts, sometimes marginally illustrated in psalters, contain sketches of trees whose berries and leaves could be used to heal or flavour food. Monks dried herbs on rafters, documented uses in herbal compendia, and taught local people techniques for preserving forest edibles. Archaeological records confirm foraging's long prevalence. Particle analysis of pottery from medieval sites reveals traces of acorns, chestnuts, and wild greens. Faunal remains often include burnt nutshells or plant residues characteristic of wild plants. These clues, combined with written legal records and herbals, paint foraging not as eccentricity but as systemic supplement, especially in poorer households. Yet foraging was not limited to the countryside. Market towns and city outskirts had their version. Hedge dwellers harvested berries and elderflowers along ancient roadways. Cottagers with back gardens relied on their soil enriched with forest litter. Urban policies mirrored rural common law indulgence. Berries, nuts, mushrooms might be taken from unplanted land. Authorities tolerated small-scale gathering to prevent unrest and malnutrition. The medieval English public realm, like today, tacitly allowed citizen collecting so long as it didn't confront property. By the late medieval period, some marginally improved foraging. Hutches and racks outside wealthier kitchens would display herbs and nuts drying. Bakers used acorn flour during grain shortages. Brewery records in abbeys list purchases of chestnut meal. Spice accounted for wealth, but peppers and cinnamon were expensive. Woods provided accessible flavour and variety. Foraging also carried economic value. In some cases, nuts and mushrooms were collected for sale or barter. Chestnut-rich villages sometimes sold to cities, exchanged with bakers or cider makers for salt or salt fish. Borough records in northern Europe document marketplaces trading wild fruit in season, often alongside church festivals. Though small-scale, this supplementary income was crucial for survival. Foragers demonstrated environmental insight. If a spot thrived with wild garlic one year, they'd return for seeds in spring, sometimes replanting near home orchards. Proto-agricultural stewardship. Reports, including wardrobe trees and hedgerow plantings by 14th and 15th century villagers, show an early form of agroforestry where foraged foods were subtly integrated into managed landscapes. In times of famine, during the Great Famine of the 14th century, during siege or harvest failure, extreme foraging became desperate. Chroniclers describe families eating boiled grass or bark, the gathering of roots and grasses born of survival, not preference. Some boiled elm bark into gruel, others ate slow-rotten acorns after leaching tannins. Such methods are disturbing, yes, but they show the breadth of knowledge and urgency people possessed when trapped between hunger and hunger. Despite its necessity, foraging retained a communal, even ceremonial quality. Villagers often set aside harvest days for mushroom gathering or hazelnut festivals. Archaeological traces include charcoal pits, hearths for drying, and pits for nut storage, matched by local songs and stories of nutting days, preserved into early modern folklore. Foraging was not hidden, it was integrated, a living link between agrarian labour, seasonal change, and communal labour cycles. In sum, medieval foraging was not quaint, it was indispensable. It provided diversity and nutrition, filled gaps between harvests, preserved ancient plant knowledge, and knitted communities to their natural surroundings. It balanced grain's bulk with flavour and survival, transformed woodland wealth into economic opportunity, preserved memory from Mesolithic gatherings to medieval hearths. It was more than supplement, it was a species of sustenance, a binder of society, a bridge between the cultivated and the wild. Yet even as the forest fed the poor and the hedgerows lined the bellies of those who could not afford market wares, food was never entirely about hunger. It was, at its heart, a spiritual matter. In the medieval world, what one ate, and when one ate it, was dictated not solely by the earth or the body, but by the soul. Religious fasting wasn't a personal preference. It was a mandate from heaven, carved into the calendar as surely as Easter or Michaelmas. More than 100 days each year were marked by fast, abstinence, or both, and they fell upon everyone, from king to monk, peasant to miller's wife. The most familiar and perhaps most intense of these fasts came with the Lenten season. For 40 days leading up to Easter, believers were expected to forgo meat, dairy, eggs, and animal fats. Some devout individuals even refused oil and wine. But Lent was not alone. Each Friday throughout the year was a day of abstinence, a small echo of the crucifixion. Vigils before feast days also required restraint, and Advent, though celebrated more joyfully today, was once a season of solemn waiting, marked by lean meals and daily discipline. But fasting did not mean starvation, it meant substitution. Fish replaced flesh. Almond milk stood in for cream, honey sweetened where butter was forbidden. The rules were strict, but medieval cooks were imaginative. In monasteries and manor kitchens, recipes blossomed under the constraints. A good cook could create a feast within the limits of a fast, crafting eel pies, almond stews, and sweetened breads that satisfied both appetite and conscience. The church itself sanctioned this cleverness. It was widely accepted, even encouraged, that cooks use their ingenuity to elevate fasting fare into something nourishing and, at times, delicious. It was an offering, after all, a way to honour sacrifice without courting despair. And yet not everyone had access to a variety of fish or imported nuts. For many poor villagers, fasting meals were little different from their usual fare: peas porridge, coarse bread, a turnip or two. If they gave up anything, it was eggs or bits of bacon fat saved for feasts. The classification of food during fasts was sometimes theological gymnastics. Fish, obviously, was not meat. But what about beaver tails? In some regions, these aquatic mammals were declared fish by clergy, a ruling which allowed the consumption of beaver flesh during Lent. Similarly, barnacle geese, believed to grow from driftwood, were sometimes excused from the meat category. The natural world was interpreted through a spiritual lens and biology bent beneath belief. Still, the fast was more than dietary. It was a mode of thought, a calendar of the heart. In towns, bells would ring to mark the beginning of Lent, and local laws forbade butchers from selling meat. Markets shifted to display fish, fresh, dried, smoked or pickled, and fasting breads made without dairy. In villages, families scraped together what they could. The fortunate might have stores of salted herring or barrels of cod, caught months earlier and cured against the cold. The less fortunate picked wild herbs, snared rabbits discreetly, or simply went without. Children, too, learned early the rhythm of denial. In Lent, eggs were no longer gathered. Milk was left for calves. And though hunger was already a near constant in many homes, the act of fasting added another layer, not one of pain, but of purpose. Even the smallest sacrifice became a step toward grace. The very act of refraining became part of one's devotion, proof of faith, measured in empty bowls and quiet prayers. But as the fasts grew long and the nights cold, the yearning for the feast sharpened. The end of Lent was not simply a return to indulgence. It was a resurrection of flavour, of fat, of joy. Easter Sunday brought roasted lamb, buttered loaves, and hard-boiled eggs dyed with onion skins and beetroot. It was a sensory miracle, the world itself returning to colour and taste. Feasting followed fasting, not in opposition but in harmony. One gave meaning to the other, and in the feasts the hierarchy revealed itself. The nobility celebrated with suckling pig and sweetened wine, peacocks refeathered and presented whole, custards set with precious saffron. The peasants, by contrast, might roast a rabbit or bake a rare meat pie, filled more with onions and oats than actual meat, but even this was celebration. The shared meal mattered more than its contents. The return of food, of flavour, of plenty, however humble, was cause for thanksgiving. To fast was to be human, medieval people believed. To feast was to be grateful. Both were necessary, both were sacred. This duality, the lean and the lavish, the restraint and the reward, defined the spiritual rhythm of medieval life. Even the calendar bore its shape. Long stretches of fasting broken by feast days scattered like jewels through the year. Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, holy feasts that turned kitchens into altars and meals into rituals. In monasteries where discipline was strictest, the fasts were observed with quiet rigour. Meals were eaten in silence, broken only by the reading of scripture. Simple stews, fish, coarse loaves. Yet even here, food was thoughtfully prepared. Hospitality was holy. Guests were served better than brothers. The stranger at the gate received the best the monastery could offer, proof that kindness was a greater fast than hunger. And so fasting endured, not because it was easy, but because it made life deeper. Each denial was a moment of connection with the poor, with the sacred, with the cycle of the year. And in that, perhaps, the medieval world found something we often forget, that the absence of a thing can sometimes make it richer, that even an empty plate can hold meaning. But where there was fasting, there would always be feasting. Just as the medieval year was punctuated with holy days of hunger, it was equally scattered with glorious permission to indulge. And when the bell rang to announce a feast day, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, or a local saint celebration, the entire village stirred like dough rising in a warm kitchen. There was joy in the air, permission, anticipation. Feasts were never merely about food. They were about rhythm, about return, about the human need to mark time, not just with the changing sky or the ticking of a church clock, but with the weight of a full belly and the laughter of neighbours. On feast days, you didn't just remember a saint or a miracle, you remembered what it was to feel abundance, even if only for a day. The preparations began early. Bread was baked in bulk, with a rare lightness to the crumb. Beer was brewed stronger, darker, richer. Meat, so often absent from the poor man's table, was hunted, cured, spiced, or simply roasted until it crackled with fat. Those who had little gave much. Those who had much gave more. And if a village had been blessed with a good harvest or a generous lord, the celebration could last for days. At Christmastide, the cold was no deterrent. Evergreen boughs hung from rafters, and spicy pies warmed the hands of children. Mutton stewed with dried fruits. Boars' heads were paraded with cloves in their snouts and apples between their teeth. In the homes of the noble, minstrels sang from table to table. And even in humble cottages, neighbours knocked on doors with gifts of bread or cheese, sometimes wrapped in linen, sometimes still steaming from the hearth. At Easter, with spring blooming and the soil soft again, the foods grew lighter. Lamb was the meat of choice, a symbol of renewal. Eggs, long forbidden during Lent, were now painted, cracked, shared. Sweet buns were baked with dried currants and honey. Candied nuts made rare appearances, and if the bees had been kind, there was honeycomb for chewing. It was a season not just of rebirth, but of relief. The cold was passing, the fast had ended, life had returned. Saints' days brought their own peculiar joys. In some towns, feast days were local and deeply personal. A shepherd's festival might include an offering of cheese wheels laid on the altar like holy relics. A blacksmith's patron day might be celebrated with fire-roasted ox and generous pours of ale. Children paraded through streets with paper crowns and willow branches. Women wove garlands, men carried torches, bells rang, and on all of these days, no matter the occasion, there was the shared meal. A table, however small, where food was laid with care. On feast days, even the poorest tried to present their best. A clean cloth, a sprig of herbs, a bit of fat saved from months before. It wasn't just about what you ate. It was about how you honoured the day with what little you had. For the wealthy, of course, feasting was a performance as much as a pleasure. Great halls were lit with dozens of candles, each flickering flame a signal of wealth. The tables groaned beneath gilded platters. Roasted birds were dressed in their own feathers, posed as if still alive. Sugared sculptures rose like towers. Spices from the east were sprinkled with abandon, not for taste, all but for display. Cinnamon. Clove, saffron so dear it was measured by the grain. Yet, even in these grand displays, the rules of feast and fast held. Meat might be layered with fish. Fasting food might be shaped to look like something forbidden. Almond paste was moulded into birds. Fish pies resembled meat. It was theatre and theology. And everyone, from stable boy to steward, played a part. At the close of these festivals, there was often a quiet moment. The embers cooled, the last bread crust was torn. A child fell asleep with a sticky cheek, a curl of honeyed dough clinging to their lip, and the people remembered why the fast mattered in the first place. Without it, the feast would lose its meaning. Without the ache, the abundance would feel hollow. And so the calendar turned, again and again, a loop of denial and delight, of silence and song. A loop written not in ink, but in what was eaten or not eaten on any given day. It wasn't only about church doctrine. It was about survival too. The fasts helped stretch winter stores. The feasts rewarded the patience. It was a system, imperfect, improvised, often unjust, but it worked. It made sense of the seasons. It gave the poor something to look forward to and the rich something to moderate. Feasting, like fasting, was a kind of devotion, a way of living deliberately, a ritual of flavour and form. And in the telling of it, today, centuries later, we might find something worth remembering. Not the grandness of the noble tables, not even the humbleness of the peasant bowl, But the way food once meant more than nutrition, the way a piece of bread shared on a saint's day could bind a community together more tightly than stone or law, the way an egg cracked at Easter after a long, lean Lent could taste like joy itself. So tonight, let your mind drift across time to a candlelit table somewhere in a village half forgotten. There is laughter, there is stew, there are soft rolls still warm. A child spins in the corner, giddy from cider. A dog licks the edge of a dripping trencher. And someone, an old woman maybe, her back bent but her voice clear, lifts her hands to bless the meal. Without refrigerators, food spoilage was the silent enemy of every table in medieval Europe. This wasn't an abstract threat. It was a force that shaped every meal, every season, every decision made in kitchens from castle hearths to humble clay ovens. The warmer months brought life to the land, but they also brought decay to the pantry. Imagine a summer day in July or August, the air heavy with ripening grain and sweat, the sun baking rooftops and thatching. In the kitchens, the scent of fresh bread mingled with the sour tang of milk turned over warm. Without cooling, dairy soured in hours. Cottage cheese stiffened with curdled tang. But it wasn't only milk. Butter, once churned, warmed and went rancid. Eggs turned quick, their thin shells hiding the slow spread of bacteria. Even the hardiest vegetables, beans, peas, young greens, started to droop, their skins limp under the midday sun. Meat was even more fleeting. In towns, butchers hung small cuts in shaded stalls, fanning them with wooden paddles to slow flies. Larger joints and whole carcasses were sky-warm by noon, smelling of copper blood and reluctant decay. The peasants brought square cuts home, knowing they had little time. A day too long, and the joints soured, 2 days, and the meat was lost. Pork, lamb, beef, none offered forgiveness for neglect. So kitchens were busy in spring and autumn, slaughtering livestock in bulk for preservation, not immediate feasting. The air carried flies, buzzing black troops eager for spoiled fruit or flesh. Nets were draped over barrels of ale or autumn's apple haul. Windows were sealed with oilcloth to keep out insects. Children were tasked with flicking away pests from porridge and puddings. Yet the insects still won more battles than they lost. Bezels of ice or snow brought temporary relief in northern regions. Wealthy houses kept snow buried under straw in pits, snow pits, to chill what they could. A few hours of coolness meant milk could carry over another season, or fish might take an extra night above the hearth. But the ice melted within days, precious time that thawed into loss. Most of these pits were underground, stone-lined and carefully shaded, small miracles of cooling found only by the fortunate. Worse still were the hidden dangers. Food could spoil long before it gave an odour. Saliva on bread crusts, cracked eggshells, tiny bruises in vegetables, the invisible gateways through which spoilage slipped. A single rotten apple in a basket could condemn dozens around it. Merchants in open markets inspected produce carefully. If one melon had a soft spot, all were touched, bruised, drained of freshness. In this precarious world, knowledge became survival. Mothers drummed the rules into their children from infancy. Boil milk twice before supper. Drain off the whey. Heat the igloo pot. It boils off sickness. It wasn't herbal placebo. Strong heat drove out bacteria. It was folk science born of long observation and whispered warnings. Fish had to be consumed fast in summer. Fresh cod would sour in a single morning. So coastal villages with streams or springs fashioned clever cooling setups. Earthen jugs were submerged in cold water, strung by ropes beside rivers and streams. Fish barrels were shaded with linen and straw. But even with these tricks, salted fish remained essential. Cod and herring were bartered inland precisely because they lasted. Yet the most ingenious survival came from those who respected spoilage and worked with it. Cheese ripened slowly and wisely. Every farmhouse bore rounds of curd that aged for weeks, crusting thick with rind. A smear of lard or oil helped protect from flies. Cured bacon and ham were hung over smoky joints, salted deeply and smoked. Smoked meats were considered safe for months, if only the drying process had been done correctly. Many a small village had a hut where slabs of pork hung, smoked over smouldering hazel or birch until no pink remained. Fermentation became preservation, even transformative. Cabbage shifted into sauerkraut, citric, sharp, alive with tang. It could carry through the winter as a vitamin-rich staple. Grains, barley, oats, wheat, were husked, dried, and kept in airtight pits or sacks sealed with beeswax. Even then, mice and rats were constant threats. Every bustle of unwanted rodent meant risk to the stored grain, which, if infected, would spoil entire seasons' worth of sowing. In the castles and monasteries, careful cellars were vaulted, stone-lined sanctuaries for food. Cool in summer, damp in winter, barrels of ale, jugs of mead, loaves lined on rafters. But even these had rules. The steward checked seals for mould. Casks were emptied and cleaned regularly. Cellars were fumigated with rosemary smoke. Spoiled goods were burned outside the walls. Food poisoning was feared and respected. This fight with spoilage shaped nearly everything about the medieval table. It determined when they were eaten. It determined who ate what. It shaped labour. Kitchen staff up at dawn to haul in the day before the heat came, hay drying in midsummer to cool cellars, butcher work scheduled for winter when meat kept. It shaped culture too. Ugly bits of cabbage buried in pits were prized scraps in soup. A single sour glob of butter might be used as medicine before going to waste. Nothing was more instructive than anecdotes handed down across generations. A story of a poor man whose entire family died after eating spoiled pottage. A lord who refused to eat cheese after a bad batch and demanded new curds. A whole village saved by salted pork when their grain crop had failed. These were lessons boiled into memory, shaping behaviours far more effectively than any written decree. The unceasing threat of spoilage forced pragmatism and care. The medieval cook wasn't a gourmand. They were a guardian, a scientist, an estimator of time and temperature, even if all measurements were by sun and season, and every survival counted. Today, we pour spoiled milk down the sink, scrape mould off bread, toss leftover roast. But in medieval times, there was no sink, no trash compactor. There was spoilage, and then there was waste. And waste meant hunger, prison, or worse. These weren't theoreticals. They were daily, unglamorous wars that shaped how people planned their fields, hunted their animals, baked their loaves, and stored their wine. That is the forgotten history of spoilage. A relentless drain on resources, a test of knowledge, a force tamed only by salt, smoke, ice, fermentation, and human vigilance. Without those tools and those skills, food would not sustain and society would falter. So, when you store milk in a fridge, recall how fragile food once was. When you dry herbs, smoke fish or salt a ham, remember what survival felt like. The constant dread of the next spoiled bowl, the gratitude for a preserved flitch, the small triumph of keeping the pantries safe. In that way, medieval people lived on the edge of rot, but they survived, thrived and built their lives around it. And because they did, today we sit with full larders, comfortable in our certainty. But their vigilance remains if we remember to honour it, by respecting food, preserving well, and always staying aware of the quiet threat spoilage brings. In the world before cold, there was only time. Time to boil, time to salt, time to smell and to know when the line had been crossed. When the meat that fed you had become the meat that might betray you. For those living in the Middle Ages, food was not merely a matter of nourishment, but of vigilance. There were no humming boxes humming in the corner to keep things fresh. No blocks of ice, no sealed plastic to warm with expiration dates. There was the sun, the wind, the warmth of the season, and the slow, inevitable bloom of spoil. Spring brought hunger and hope. Summer brought plenty, but also rot. As the days grew longer and the air thicker, food turned quicker. A haunch of pork left in a warm pantry could sour by evening. A bowl of milk fresh from the cow in the morning might curdle by noon if left untouched. Fish caught at dawn might, by dusk, reek of the sea's darker side. Spoilage did not wait for permission. It crept in silently, fuzzing over fruit, swelling bread, clouding the eyes of a trout that had been sweet and clear just hours before. And so people learned to watch, to sniff, to stir, to test. It was a sensory world, ruled by the nose and the tongue and the keen memory of past mistakes. A housewife might lift the lid of a stew pot and know instantly that something had turned. A monk in a monastery kitchen might pass his hand above a wheel of cheese and feel the wrong heat radiating from its core. Children were taught young, don't eat what smells wrong, don't drink what clings too thick to the throat. But sometimes there was no choice. Hunger made gamblers of even the cautious. A bit of meat just on the edge, if boiled long enough, perhaps it could still be safe. A crust with mould scraped off, the middle still soft. A stew stretched with sour milk, masked by onions and pepper. They were not fools, they knew the risks. But when the stores ran low and the fields were not yet ready, when the pigs had been slaughtered but the next litter not yet born, sometimes even questionable food was a blessing, and sometimes it killed. There are no written records of most deaths caused by spoiled food, no grave markers for bad meat, no saints canonized for surviving a suspicious cheese. But in the whispered memory of village life, such dangers were understood. People spoke in euphemisms. The stew sat too long, his stomach turned, she died in the night after a bad bite. The symptoms were known: stomach pain, fever, vomiting, visions. In some cases it passed. In others, the earth opened quickly. Mothers grew watchful. Cooks learned tricks. Boil it again, add more vinegar, feed the worst bits to the dog first and see if it lives through the night. These were not scientific methods, but they worked more often than not. And when they didn't, another lesson was passed down. The seasons shaped the risk. In winter, the cold was an ally. Meat hung outside in stone sheds might freeze solid. Butter could be kept in clay pots buried in snowbanks. The chill slowed the invisible hand of rot. But in the warmth, oh, the warmth was treacherous. Summer kitchens became laboratories of decay. Flies danced on meat hooks. Milk turned before it reached the table. Bread grew damp beneath linen. And so people rushed. They cooked what they caught. They shared meals with haste. They ate what would not last and dried or salted what could be saved. Some foods were safer than others. Dry grains kept longer than wet porridge. Smoked sausages lasted weeks, while fresh poultry needed immediate attention. Pickled things, onions, beets, cabbage, had the tang of protection. But nothing was guaranteed. Not even a salted fish could be fully trusted if kept too long or stored in the wrong place. And so, kitchens became battlegrounds against the invisible. Herbs were hung to ward off flies. Jars were sealed with fat. Eggs were stored in ash or lime water. Tools were washed in boiling broth. And still the rot came. It came because the world was alive, and life inevitably means decay. But there was beauty in the struggle, in the way people adapted, in the recipes born from necessity, in the sharp soups, the vinegar pies, the pickled roots, in the stews made rich with things just before they turned, in the rituals of testing and tasting and trusting the senses more than any rule. They did not have fridges, but they had instincts, they had tradition, and they had each other. Spoilage was a danger, yes, but it also shaped culture. It dictated when feasts must be held. The lamb won't last another day, let's call the neighbours. It influenced architecture. Build the storehouse facing north, let it stay cool. It built communities, food shared before it spoiled, leftovers given to those in need. The sudden blessing of too much becoming a moment of generosity. And in that way, even rot had its purpose. It reminded them of the rhythms of life, of time's passage, of the need to preserve, prepare, and plan. And so they watched their pots, they hung their meat high, they sniffed the milk and stirred the stew and prayed the weather would stay cool. They used what they had, stretched it as long as they could, and let no morsel go to waste without a fight. Because food, once gone bad, took more than a meal. It stole effort, memory, and the promise of another day. And so in every warm corner of every medieval kitchen, you could find a quiet war against spoilage. No banners, no battle songs, just noses, hands, and hopeful hearts, standing guard over the day's bread. Salt was far more than a seasoning. It was a strategic resource, a trade commodity, and a lifeline. Known as white gold, salt shaped economies, societies, and daily survival across Europe and beyond. Without it, meat could not be preserved, fish would rot, and entire food networks would collapse. Beginning with salt's practical role, curing and preserving food. In a world with no refrigeration, salt was essential for extending the shelf life of meat and fish. Slabs of pork, entire hams, bits of fish were rubbed with coarse salt, packed in wooden barrels or ceramic jars, and stored in cool, dry spaces. The salt drew moisture from the flesh and created an inhospitable environment for bacteria, allowing food to be kept for months, crucial for surviving lean seasons. In the rural south of France, entire flocks of sheep and herds of pigs were salted each autumn. The cured meat would not only feed families through winter, but also serve as valuable trade goods. Salt production was expensive and tightly controlled. In coastal regions, Brittany, northern Italy, Andalusia, the sea was deliberately flooded into shallow salt pans. The water evaporated under the sun, leaving behind salty crystals known as sea salt. Inland, salt came from springs. Lüneburg in Germany, Salzkammergut in Austria, and Wieliczka near Krakow were famous for salt mines or brine pools. These sites were often tied to monasteries or local lords who held a salt monopoly and levied taxes, or gabelle, on its sale. In France, the gabelle was notorious. It retailed salt at far higher prices than experts in other countries, fueling public resentment and even playing a minor role in the French Revolution 3 centuries later. Because salt was taxed and regulated, it carried political weight. The lord of the salt springs or the king's appointees managed production, storage and sale. Regulations governed weight and purity. Unauthorised salt trade was punished with fines or confiscation. Salt smuggling was common and risky, but the profits made it widespread. The routes used for transporting salt across rivers through valleys were as critical to medieval logistics as grain routes. They shaped roads and towns. Facilities such as salt storehouses were among the wealthiest buildings in towns like Lüneburg and Worms. Salt's value extended beyond preservation. In hard land and tough tradition, salt was used culturally, shared during weddings, sprinkled on fields and doorways to promote fertility or ward off evil, even used in religious ceremonies. Roman customs persisted. Salt was part of oath-taking, and to have salt at one's table signified hospitality and wealth. The phrase "not worth his salt" emerged later, but its origin lies in salt's historic value. Economically, salt was a major revenue source. Monks in Champagne, Burgundy, or Tuscany managed salines both to feed their own communities and to generate income. The Benedictine Abbey of Cluny, for example, used profits from salt to fund church building and charitable works. Strategically placed along rivers on salt routes, towns grew rich on salt. Trade fairs in places like Champagne or Ilkley became hubs of regional salt commerce. Salt's trade created demand for pack horses, carts, river barges, inns, and toll booths. Along the Rhine, salt barges travelled to inland markets like Cologne and Mainz, carrying not just the salt itself, but prosperity in their wake. Salt also affected diet. In coastal and monastic fare, salted cod or herring were staples on fast days. Inland people relied on salted meats or transported salt to brine fish they imported. In Eastern Europe, where rivers did not support fish trade easily, salted pork became a necessity. Salted fat, lard, was stored in crocks for frying and cooking through winter months. Without salt, there would have been no bacon, no pickled vegetables, no brined cheeses. Salt played a role in diseases too. It was believed that salt purged the body's humours. In the humoral theory that governed medieval medicine, salt's drying quality counteracted excess phlegm. Dissolved in water or wine, it was used as a disinfectant. Salt rubbed into wounds symbolised a preservative against decay, both spiritual and physical. Thorn wounds in cattle barns were cauterised with salt to prevent infection. Salted plasters were common home remedies for ulcers, abscesses or skin sores. Control of salt also meant control of famine. In several documented famines, like the Great Famine of 1315-1317, salt was hoarded by the wealthy and sold only at elite prices, while peasants suffered spoiled food. Some towns enacted ordinances requiring fair salt pricing or forbade salt exportation during famine. In 14th century Germany, certain cities decreed penalties on merchants who hoarded more salt than they could store in a month's supply. As governments centralised in the 16th and 17th centuries, salt remained a symbol of authority. Royal salt monopolies became commonplace in France, Spain, Portugal. Salt taxes funded projects from roads to wars, but they also sparked uprisings. In Brittany, the Bonnet Rouge rebels of 1675 rioted over salt prices. In England, the assizes of bread and ale regulated the salt used in baking and brewing, ensuring consistent weight and price for common goods. By contrast, the common folk valued their small private stores. A ceramic jar with a few handfuls of salt sat on the kitchen table. Children grew up measuring salt in their porridge, measuring life by the granules. Even a single pinch could flavour a stew pot, clear broth or sweet berry wine. Salt shaped taste and memory. Its scarcity taught restraint. Its worth taught respect. The arrival of new sea routes in the 15th and 16th centuries, expanding Portuguese and Spanish interests, opened global salt sources. Oceanic trade undercut some inland monopolies and made salt cheaper in ports. But deep inland, salt remained a necessity, not a commodity. Forest salt remains critical even today in some Eastern European villages where salt springs are still tapped for meat curing. In modern terms, salt may seem common, but history begs appreciation. No preservative culture without salt. Without salt, medieval society would have been more vulnerable to spoilage, famine, even political unrest. Salt built roads, funded abbeys, defined cities, shaped taste, and saved lives. It was, in a word, indispensable. After salt, there were other guardians of food in the medieval world. Less expensive, more accessible, but equally essential. Smoking, drying, pickling. These were the quiet crafts of preservation, practiced in kitchen hearths by smoky barns and in the shade of monastery walls. Without refrigeration, these methods were not luxuries but lifelines, techniques born from necessity, refined through generations and passed down by calloused hands and watchful eyes. Smoking was one of the oldest tools in the peasant's arsenal. It began as a side effect. Meat hung near the fire, simply to keep it out of reach from dogs or flies. But the villagers learned quickly. The smoke did something more. It hardened the outer layer of the flesh, drew out moisture, and coated the meat with compounds that helped stave off rot. What began as instinct became tradition. Over time, homes and barns alike were built with smoke lofts and rafters designed for hanging meat. Hams, sausages, strips of bacon, they all curled and darkened above the hearth, slowly transforming under the patient veil of wood smoke. Each region had its wood of choice. In northern Europe, alder and oak were favoured. In southern lands, fruitwoods added sweetness. The choice of wood wasn't just about flavour, it affected how long the meat lasted. Peasants learned this the hard way. Too soft to smoke and the meat would spoil before winter's end. Too bitter and no one would eat it. But when done right, smoked pork could last for months. It could be sliced thin into pottage, fried on feast days, or even sent to market if the family had surplus to spare. A good smokehouse wasn't just a tool, it was wealth protection, food security, and pride. Drying was another craft altogether. Unlike smoking, it needed sun, wind, and a dry climate, or a well-ventilated attic if nature couldn't be trusted. Beans, peas, and grains were laid out on mats or hung in bunches. Herbs were tied into bundles, their scents sweetening the rafters. In warmer months, even fish were salted and then laid across racks to dry, their silver skins turning stiff under the summer sun. Dried cod, stockfish, became a trade staple, especially in the north. It could travel great distances without spoiling, which made it valuable to monasteries and merchant towns alike. In Iceland, Norway, and Scotland, drying fish was a national habit. In inland villages, small strips of meat or offal might be dried beside the fire, not tasty, but sustaining. Pickling was where the kitchen became a chemist's workshop. It didn't always mean vinegar, at least not the way we think of it now. In the early medieval period, vinegar was harder to come by and expensive. More often, pickling was done with brine, salt water, and the natural fermentation that followed. Cabbages, turnips, carrots, and onions could be packed into crocks, weighted with stones, and left to ferment in cool corners. Over time, they turned sour, tangy, and safe to eat. This wasn't the pickle we find on modern sandwiches. It was sharp, funky, and often cloudy, but it added brightness to otherwise bland meals and was a source of essential nutrients, especially in the dead of winter. Monasteries were the scientists of these methods. With their careful record-keeping, enclosed gardens, and access to salt and storage, they refined preservation into an art. Monks made smoked eels, dried apples, and pickled beets. They wrote down ratios, tested storage times, and passed on this knowledge in quiet Latin script. What they preserved wasn't just food, it was knowledge, and it spread, bit by bit, to villages, manors, and cities. But not everything preserved well, and not everything was worth the effort. Milk, for example, spoiled quickly, so it was turned into cheese instead. Soft fruits were dried or made into rough pastes, stored in crocks, eaten sparingly. Eggs were a challenge. Some were packed in ash or salt, others pickled in brine or preserved in lime water. None were perfect solutions. The medieval household accepted a certain amount of spoilage as inevitable, but every bit saved meant less hunger down the line. In larger households, especially among the gentry, there were designated pantries for these stores. Cool, dark rooms with stone walls and heavy wooden shelves. The steward or cook kept strict records. What meats were smoked, what fish were laid down in barrels, what barrels bubbled with brined cabbage. In poor homes, these same techniques happened on a smaller scale. A hook above the fire, a pot buried near the garden, a bundle of herbs drying by the door. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Spoilage was always lurking, though. Mould, maggots, rats. If a pickle jar cracked or the weather turned too damp, an entire batch could be lost. The smell was the first warning, then the colour, then the taste. But once food was scarce, even that wasn't enough to stop some from eating it anyway. Hunger made people brave, or desperate. Still, when preservation worked, it brought peace. A smoked ham hanging untouched in the rafters meant security. A crock of sour turnips in the pantry meant the children would have something to eat if the frost lingered. Dried beans and peas, sorted by hand and stored in sacks, could be simmered into thick stews with just a bone or two for flavour. These foods weren't glamorous, but they were the backbone of survival. And so, across centuries and kingdoms, the humble arts of smoking, drying and pickling stitched their way through the rhythm of medieval life. They filled the gap between harvests. They stretched the bounty of autumn into the lean months of February. They allowed markets to function, monasteries to feed the poor, and soldiers to march with rations in their packs. And perhaps most importantly, they gave people a sense of control, however small, over a world ruled by weather, war and want. Even now, centuries later, their echoes remain. In the tang of a pickled onion, the scent of a smoked sausage, the crinkle of dried herbs in a kitchen drawer, ancient techniques, born from need, lingering still, not as curiosities but as comforts. So as the firelight fades and the night deepens, let your thoughts drift back, not to banquets or kings, but to the quiet work of preservation, to the hands that salted, smoked and stewed, to the mothers who tasted for spoilage, the monks who stirred their pickles, the children who waited for spring. Because survival in the medieval world was not just about what you had, but what you could keep. The turning of the year marked a shift not just in seasons, but in survival. By autumn, fields lay bare, livestock were fattened, and every household braced for the long months ahead. Fall was more than harvest. It was a grand logistical operation, a moment when work meant life through winter. Bread, meat, drink, and root crops had to be prepared, not just once, but carefully, with foresight and communal effort. By late September, grain gluts were common and grain prices low. That was no accident. Lords timed their threshing to coincide with minimal market demand. Peasants stoked ovens and kneaded loaves by the dozens, using their last fresh flour to bake hardtack-style bread, dense, dry, and built for longevity. Most of it was too tough to eat directly, so it was sliced, broken, or soaked in broth. The real work came next. Barley and oats, considered lower quality grain, were often parboiled and dried to preserve them for porridge and ale-making. Animal slaughter peaked in September and October. This timing allowed carcasses to mature with summer fat, while still giving time for curing before the deep freeze. Entire hogs were butchered on a single day in villages, creating a surge in demand for salt, smoke, and pickling vats. Curing houses overflowed with salted bacon and hams, smoked joints, and brined fat. Even the innards were used. Chitterlings boiled into sausage, lard rendered for cooking, and lamp oil, and offal given to dogs. Then came the pressing of cider and perry in apple and pear-rich areas. Large wooden presses turned the bounty of orchards into drink and preserves. A barrel of cider was notable for its longevity, and sometimes transported with hay padding into cold cellars. The stronger the drink, the longer it kept, and for many, it was safer than water and a warmth-bringing staple during winter months. Root cellaring was a task taken seriously. Families dug pits lined with straw or sand for turnips, carrots, parsnips and beets. These were layered carefully, earth packed around them to maintain stability. Stored in cool darkness, these vegetables could hold fresh from December until March. This diet of roots, cereal and salted meats formed the backbone of subsistence. Monasteries and larger manors took autumn prep to another level. Their lay brothers and lay sisters spent entire days segregating grain, testing acidity of cider, killing lice in stored fabrics, and inspecting wine casks. They measured humidity with straw splints, tested seals by burning straw in cellars, or letting smoke stand silent, unmoving inside a sealed bin. Longevity lay in that attention to detail. By the time the black frosts came, the world slowed. Fields lay dormant beneath frost, livestock were tucked into winter barns, and granaries stood heavy with stores. Still, the preserved food circulated slowly. Salted pork, dried beans, cheese, pickled vegetables, and hard bread. Soup pots simmered daily on hearths. Bread might be soaked in ale gruel. A mash of oats, barley, or millet served as the base. And from these leftovers came a surprising continuity, a sense of calm despite the cold. This procession of autumn to winter shaped medieval views of time itself. Feast days lined up with harvest, All Hallows with apple cider or nut breads. Martinmas, or St. Martin's Day in November, celebrated with goose or fattened goose eggs, symbolising the moment preparations were complete and winter could begin. Advent followed, but the bulk of provisioning lay behind. However, failure in autumn prep meant a merciless winter. A wet harvest could rot grain stacks. Too little salt meant meat-free days. A spoiled cider barrel meant weaker drink. A lichened root pit meant few fresh vegetables. And once winter set in, no door opened for new stores. The price of failure became hunger and hardship. But where there was preparation, there was resilience. The old world was one of planning, passing knowledge by doing. People paid closer attention to weather patterns and seasonal rhythms because their lives depended on them. In autumn, they harvested not only crops, but hope against maps too narrow to those who freeze. And so harvest became a ritualised season, filling not just physical pantries but households with insurance. There was a logic to exhaustion at the end of a harvest day. It wasn't toil, but reassurance. A communal contract signed in bushels and barrels. Tonight, let the rhythm of those days, harvesting, smoking, pressing, cellaring, settle around you like straw stacked beneath a cool sky. Let the memory of hands lifting root vegetables, of barns dark with cider, of smoke drifting over smoked sausages guide you into rest. Remember that in their world, abundance and scarcity existed side by side, and autumn was the turning point. Let yourself now begin to dwell in the quiet strength of their rhythm, and find peace in the preparation that makes the darkest nights survivable. In a world where spoilage was a constant threat, medieval cooks turned to something both clever and desperate: flavour. When food began to show signs of weakness, when meat smelled less of savoury broth and more of earth or iron, the solution wasn't always to discard it. In many households, rich or poor, a clever combination of spices, herbs and vinegar could transform questionable fare into acceptable, or at least edible, meals. Spices in medieval kitchens were status symbols, but they were also practical tools. Rare and costly, they masked taste, covered odour, and sometimes even had preservative qualities. Cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, ginger, imported from the East, were treasured. When a stew began to sour, a handful of crushed pepper or a shard of cinnamon bark could make the broth sharp and warming instead of dull and unpleasant. Vinegar, made from wine or cider, added acidity, cutting through the stale fat of meats stored too long or oils rendered in imperfect conditions. Even the wealthy had spoilage issues. In manor halls, great salt-preserved joints of meat hung in cellars, but unless cooked quickly, their fat turned rancid. To disguise this, cooks created cordials of vinegar, spiced with saffron and boiled down wine. Some recipes called for verjuice, unripe grape juice, horseradish, mustard, or even mildly pickled quinces added to heavy dishes. The result was a sharp, piquant sauce that drew attention away from the questionable protein beneath. Vinegar alone carried power. It was routine in pantries, stored in thick clay jugs sealed with grease. A drizzle in a pottage or broth could offer freshness even if the meat was past its prime. Mixed with honey or wine, vinegar became a restorative tonic. 2 ounces in the morning said to chase away fevers. Such remedies doubled as meal improvers, a trick to both treat and mask. The poor also used vinegar, but in simpler ways. Low-class pickling, often called compost, consisted of chopped root vegetables laid in brine with rough Northfield vinegar made from cheap beer. This mash was pungent, sour and filling. More than decoration, it served to make thin pottage or stale bread more palatable. When meat was sparse, even a smattering of onion or leek in vinegar could impart gusto. Herbs and aromatic greens played a part. Couples walked through fields, gathering parsley, fennel, sage, sweet cicely. These were bundled and hung to dry, then crumbled into food. A handful could brighten a stale broth. A clump of mint could scent a bad stew. Monasteries cultivated medicinal gardens precisely for this reason. Row upon row of thyme, rosemary and marjoram grew not for show but for survival. Ale, too, was a weapon against spoilage. Strong medieval ale, untamed by refrigeration, soured and became acidic. A cup poured into the cooking pot gave sparkle and bitterness that covered dullness in boiled legumes or off-flavoured grains. In coastal towns, fish themselves offered vinegar. Sauced fish pies and jellied fish spread with onion and vinegar served not only as delicacy but as flavour maskers. The sour profile kept the fishiness in check and the bacteria less hospitable. Of course, this practice carried risk. Vinegar masked scent, it couldn't make truly rotten food safe. Some earned a dangerous reputation from eating disguised, tainted meals. Yet knowledge grew. A spoon of vinegar was enough to help an old broth, but it couldn't hide the texture of meat that was sloughing off the bone. Mashed legumes or crumbed bread often hid spoiled batch smells. Cooks learned texture was as critical as smell. The medieval cookbook Form of Cury, c. 1390, reflects this approach. Several recipes specify adding vinegar, parsley, eggs, and spices to seal meat in flavourful pottage. Chroniclers of the time comment that poor households set vinegar on every table, not for elegance but survival. This masking extended beyond the hearth. Inns charging for ale and bread had to maintain reputation. A tavern keeper in 14th century London was fined for serving sour meat, but not because it was infected, because customers complained about the smell. The keeper responded by boiling the meat with pepper, adding strong beer, which saved his licence for a while. It's easy to criticise this as unsanitary. But in the context of medieval risk, vinegar and spice represented ingenuity. They bought time, disguised absence, and allowed for fuller tables during lean periods. When a guest arrived unexpectedly, a household with leftover stew could add enough vinegar and herbs to pass it off as fresh. Had laws existed restricting such practices, they would have seen them as craft, not fraud. There was also a moral dimension. In religious abstinence, monks were to eat simple meals. Food with elaborate spices was frowned upon, yet vinegar graces even monastic recipes. Always permitted for flavour, never for indulgence. Wine vinegar, pills of ginger and clove. They were medicinal, not luxurious. This permitted the use of pungent seasoning for monks too, especially during fasts, though the intention was to ease hunger, not pleasure. Modern science shows that vinegar can reduce bacterial load, particularly for E. coli and salmonella. Cloves and cinnamon contain essential oils with antiseptic qualities. Medieval cooks didn't know this in lab terms, but they knew that well-spiced meat smelled less sour and lasted a day longer. Their kitchens were chemists' labs dressed in practicality, not science jargon, but often more effective than we give credit for. These practices also shaped diet. Meals in winter were no longer bland, stale sloops, but sharp-flavoured feasts. Vinegar adding brightness to cabbage dishes, honeyed condiments sweetening dryness. Spices made hardtack taste richer. Ale bred into porridge lessened the grain's monotony. Peppery sauces became essential in winter cooking, not indulgence, but necessity. And so households kept jugs of vinegar at hand and spices in sealed pots, a luxury container even for the poor. Every bite was tested with tongue and taste, checked for sharpness of the acids and warmth of the spices. Had a meal lost its edge, vinegar might bring it back from the brink. This reliance shaped trade too. Pepper taxes formed a healthy revenue stream. Spices carried across caravans, barges over mountains, layered into culture and survival. Vinegar, often made in monastery vaults or manor cellars, circulated in barrels. Chemistry might be hidden in its acidity, but it was everywhere. Toward the end of the medieval age, as trade made spices slightly more accessible, vinegar and seasoning trickled into common homes. Pepper became found in coarse bread, dillgrass flavourings in pickles. And though some of these traditions shelved as printing spread and pasteurisation became possible, the habit of flavouring to preserve remained. It's the subtle art behind vinegar treats and spiced meats even today. So, as you drift to sleep tonight, respect the small jug of vinegar in your pantry, the pepper in your shaker. They descend from medieval ingenuity, bold tools wielded against spoilage, humble solutions to invisible peril. They are history in taste, survival in spice. It didn't take much, a bite too ripe, a broth left out too long, a sausage that smelled fine until it didn't. In a world without thermometers, expiration dates or sealed packaging, food poisoning was not rare. It was a silent threat that nestled in stews and breads, lurked in leftovers, and sometimes waited even in the prized meats of a feast. People didn't use the word poisoning, not in the way we do. They might speak of ill humours or bad meats. They might say a dish had turned or was corrupt. But the consequences were unmistakable. Sweating, vomiting, gut cramps so violent they curled the body into knots. And sometimes death. A bowl of soup could betray you. So could a pie, lovingly baked, filled with what meat was left after a week of storms. Spoilage was quick. Kitchens were warm. Rodents were constant. And if the meat was old enough or tainted enough, no amount of boiling could save you. The line between nourishment and danger was thin, and everyone walked it. Among the poor, survival meant eating what was available, not necessarily what was fresh. A wheel of cheese, speckled with green, might be scraped and still served. Bread with a bit of mould? Toast it and call it good. There were folk beliefs that heat could kill whatever was bad. And sometimes it could, but not always. Some moulds, some parasites, some bacteria, those didn't yield to a little heat or a splash of vinegar. In rural villages, outbreaks weren't tracked, but they were remembered. That year when the stew turned sour, the harvest feast that took 3 lives. No one needed a physician to connect the dots. When the same group of people ate the same dish and half fell ill, it wasn't mystery, it was food, or more specifically, something hidden within it. One of the most dangerous sources of food poisoning was meat from animals that had died of illness. A pig that dropped dead in the night might still be butchered by morning if no one saw the sickness take it. Waste not, want not. And in lean times the risk seemed worth it, but the price could be high. Even the noble kitchens, with their rows of cooks and spiced wines, were not immune. Rich foods, soaked in sauces and left to sit for hours, could turn. And because these dishes were elaborate, their dangers were harder to notice. A small piece of bad meat in a heavily herbed stew might not taste off, but it might be deadly by morning. Pottage left uncovered could ferment. Cream might curdle before it reached the table. Fish, especially, was suspect. In monasteries and manors alike, fish was eaten in bulk during fasting days. Salted, dried, sometimes rehydrated hours before dinner. But if it wasn't dried thoroughly, or if the salt hadn't fully penetrated the flesh, bacteria flourished. There were no microscopes, no scientific understanding of E. coli or salmonella, but people learned the signs. They feared sudden illness, stomach cramps, bloody stools, and they had their cures, or what they thought were cures. Some drank vinegar, some turned to wine or strong spirits, hoping to burn away the bad. Some chewed bitter herbs like wormwood or rue. A few consulted the local wise woman, who might mix a poultice or an herbal draught, but most simply endured. If the food made them ill, they waited, sweated and prayed. In households that could afford it, a taster was employed, someone who would sample dishes before they were served to lords and ladies. This practice, more often used to prevent poisoning by enemies, also served as an early warning for bad food. If the taster faltered, the dish was discarded. But among the poor, there were no tasters, no spare meals. If the only loaf left had a strange smell, it was still eaten. If the stew had sat out since yesterday, it was reheated and served again. One of the lesser-known dangers was ergot, a fungus that grew on damp rye. It was nearly invisible to the eye, but potent. Ingesting bread made from ergot-contaminated grain could cause hallucinations, convulsions, even death. Some now believe that entire outbreaks of dancing sickness or accusations of witchcraft may have stemmed from this poisoned bread. But in the Middle Ages, no one knew. The bread was made, it was eaten, and when people danced or screamed or died, they blamed demons, not mould. Milk, too, turned quickly. Without refrigeration, fresh milk soured within a day. People learned to curdle it deliberately, creating cheese, yogurt, or buttermilk. But accidental spoiling led to more than a foul taste. Children, especially, were vulnerable. A bad bowl of porridge could sicken a toddler by nightfall. The monastery infirmaries saw it often, cases of flux or fever of the belly. They treated the symptoms, leeches, purgatives, fasting. But without understanding bacteria, cures were guesswork. Some recovered, many didn't. And yet people persisted. They sniffed and stirred and hoped. They boiled their meats a little longer. They learned to salt more heavily. They watched what happened when a neighbour ate a suspect dish and waited before trying it themselves. Food was joy. food was danger. The same pot that warmed you could lay you low. And so mealtime was not just about hunger. It was about trust. Trust in the cook, trust in the preservation, trust in the luck of the day. We may look back and marvel at what they risked, but for them it wasn't risk, it was routine. To eat in the Middle Ages was to walk a tightrope over a pit of invisible threats, and yet they crossed it every day because there was no other way. So as you settle in, warm and full and safe from such dangers, think of those whose nights were not so assured, who lay on straw mattresses with bellies churning and hearts racing, unsure if the roast was too old or the cheese too sour, who prayed that the meal would hold and not betray them. And yet, despite it all, people lived. They adapted, they learned, and over centuries, those lessons, hard-earned and often painful, paved the way for something better. But not before many slept uneasy, bellies full but uncertain, whispering quiet prayers into the dark. It sat at the centre of every medieval table, not as decoration, but as certainty. Bread, not a choice, but a staple, a thing so constant that to break bread was to begin a meal, and to lack bread was to begin a famine. It came in many forms, from soft wheaten loaves baked in the ovens of manor kitchens, to rough, dark slabs chipped from peasant rounds so hard they echoed when struck. But no matter its texture or taste, bread was never thrown out lightly. In the Middle Ages, the notion of bread going mouldy, fuzzy, green, uneaten, was not common, and that was for a very simple reason. It didn't have the chance. Bread rarely sat long enough to turn. When a loaf did grow stale, it simply changed purpose. Nothing in a medieval household, particularly among the lower classes, was truly waste. A crust too dry for chewing could be softened in broth, grated into crumbs, or used as a trencher, a hard plate of bread meant to soak up sauce, meat drippings, or soup. Once it had done its duty, the trencher might be eaten by a servant or given to the poor. If not, it fed the pigs, or even the fire. There were also practical reasons why medieval bread didn't often spoil with mould. It was baked without the preservatives or moisture levels we use today. Dense, dry, and thick-crusted loaves were less welcoming to mould than their modern counterparts. Especially when made from rye, barley, or other coarser grains, the bread could harden before it could rot, becoming more stone than sponge. Still, not all breads were created equal. The whitest loaves, made from sifted wheat flour, were the prized luxury of the wealthy. Called manchet in England, this soft, pale bread was reserved for noble tables. It spoiled more quickly due to its finer texture and higher moisture, but it was consumed so swiftly, often on the same day it was baked, that mould had no chance. In contrast, the poor ate what was called maslin or horse bread, rough loaves made from mixed grains, often with bran oat or pea flour. These loaves were darker, coarser and tougher. Baked in communal ovens or home hearths, they were made to last, if not to delight. Yet even the hardiest loaf had its dangers. In some regions, especially where rye was a staple, bread could become host to a silent killer, ergot. A fungus that infested rye under damp conditions, ergot caused severe illness when consumed. Its victims might suffer hallucinations, burning limbs, convulsions, and even death. It came to be called St. Anthony's fire, and whole villages were sometimes struck when a harvest turned bad and bread was unknowingly poisoned. The people didn't understand the cause, only the terror it brought. Even so, bread remained central to survival. It was currency and comfort, symbol and sustenance. Medieval laws even regulated it, from the assise of bread in England, which set fixed weights and prices, to religious customs requiring it to be blessed, offered or withheld. In monasteries, in castles, in village cottages, bread marked time and class and faith. And when times were lean, people adapted. Bread was stretched with acorns, with legumes, with sawdust, if it came to that. Stale didn't mean spoiled. It meant the next day's meal, the next stew's thickener, the start of crumbs to coat fried fish or stuff a bird. In colder months, families would hang loaves near the hearth, hardening them into edible tools. In warmer weather, they kept bread wrapped in cloth or tucked into clay jars, preserving it from rats and damp air. Children learned the rhythms of bread making early, the grind of the quernstone, the rise of the dough in its earthen pot, the careful tending of the embers. And when the loaf cooled, it was touched, tapped, judged. Fresh bread was a blessing, but old bread, properly handled, was no curse. So they kept every crust, softened it, sliced it, saved it. Bread wasn't just eaten, it was reused, remade, redeemed. Because to waste bread in the Middle Ages wasn't just careless, it was unthinkable. Preservation wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, as vital to survival as the harvest itself. In a world without refrigeration, every season brought urgency. What could be gathered in the warmth had to last through the cold. And so medieval people turned to preservation not as a craft or a curiosity, but as a daily ritual woven into the very fabric of survival. Salt, as we've seen, was the guardian of longevity. But it wasn't the only ally. Drying, pickling, fermenting, smoking, these were the quiet magics of the medieval kitchen, performed not with science, but with skill, passed from mouth to ear, from hand to hand over generations. Fish were some of the most frequently preserved foods. Herring and cod, particularly in northern Europe, were salted, then hung to dry on racks in the open air or smoked slowly over fires. These stiff, salted slabs could travel across seas and borders, feeding armies and abbeys alike. A single barrel of preserved herring might feed a village through winter or supply monks during Lenten fasts when meat was forbidden, but fish, mercifully, was not. Meat, too, found new life through preservation. Pork was most commonly salted or smoked, turned into bacon, ham or sausages. A pig, once slaughtered, was not simply consumed fresh. It was portioned, packed in salt, hung in cool chambers or smoked in chimney lofts. Families planned for the pig-killing season, sometimes inviting neighbours to help, sharing both labour and resulting cuts. It was work, but it was also ceremony, a yearly rhythm etched into rural life. Vegetables didn't escape the preserving hand either. Root vegetables were stored in cellars, layered in straw or buried in sand to keep them from spoiling. Others were pickled. Carrots, turnips, onions, steeped in vinegar with spices or herbs, became compost, a kind of medieval coleslaw that accompanied meats and helped cut through rich fats. Cheese, that staple of both peasants and nobles, was not just a food, it was preservation in edible form. Fresh milk spoiled in hours. Cheese could last months, and depending on its type it could be kept in brine, smoked, or stored in cool, dark rooms until it hardened into something sharp, robust, and enduring. Fruits were dried, apples sliced and strung, plums turned into prunes, grapes into raisins. In southern regions, the sun did most of the work. Warm ovens or open hearths gave their heat after bread baking was done. Dried fruits sweetened porridges, brightened winter feasts, and became the cherished treats of Christmas tables. Even bread, that daily essential, was preserved in its own way, baked into hard biscuits for travel, or dried and grated into crumbs to be rehydrated later. Nothing, if it could be helped, was wasted. And then there were the more curious methods. Fermentation, for instance, didn't just apply to wine or ale. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Milk, left in the right conditions, turned into curds, sour cream, or soft cheeses. Fermentation wasn't feared. It was embraced, a sign not of spoilage, but of transformation, of life continuing in another form. Preservation was also a kind of memory. The smell of smoked fish or dried herbs recalled the harvest months. A jar of pickled turnips was a small triumph against the silence of snow. These foods weren't just for eating, they were for surviving, for enduring, for holding on to something bright when the sky turned grey and the ground turned hard. In monasteries, preserving food became near sacred. Monks carefully logged stores of salted meats, pickled vegetables, and dried fruits. In noble estates, entire cellars were devoted to salted barrels and smoked meats, their stone walls holding the scent of centuries. Even in the humblest homes, a hook in the chimney or a pot of vinegar in the corner spoke of quiet preparation, the ever-present hope that what was gathered would last. Of course, not every attempt worked. A cut of meat too thinly salted might rot. A jar not sealed might sour. But failure was learned from, because preservation wasn't optional. It was survival science, practiced without parchment or parchment-trained scholars. Just knowledge, lived. And so, across every class, in every region, preserving food became a kind of second harvest, the capturing of plenty before the world turned lean. In a time without iceboxes or modern preservation, cheese stood as one of the most ingenious ways to preserve milk, and one of the most widely relied upon staples across Europe. Wherever cows, goats or sheep grazed, cheese emerged as a solution centuries old and practical, quietly demonstrating how even simple dairy could become sustainable nutrition when treated with care. Immediately after milking, families and monasteries moved quickly. Milk was heated, curdled, and separated into curds and whey. The whey was drained off, while the curds were salted, sometimes heavily, and packed into wooden moulds to drain further. In cooler months, this process transformed fresh milk into firm, durable cheese that could last months without spoiling. Unlike fresh milk, which soured within hours in summer, aged cheese could sit safely through months of changing weather, offering nutrition and fats when milking did not. There was incredible variety in cheese types, from soft, mild curd cheeses intended for quick consumption, to hard, sharp wheels matured in cool cellars. Monasteries became true cheese laboratories. Abbeys like Roquefort, Stilton, or Gouda experimented with mould-loving caves, unique strains of bacteria, and pressing techniques. Their records show attention to humidity, temperature, turning frequencies, and even the spiritual benefits of aging cheese during certain holy seasons. Cheese was critical to every level of society. For peasants, a modest cheese wheel meant calories preserved from spring into winter, enjoyed slice by slice. For nobles, ornate cheese boards might include imported varieties, sometimes elaborately scored with designs. Tithes sometimes required cheeses to be offered to the church. Fairs featured wheels large enough to roll in contests. Indeed, in some towns, cheese regulated both economy and ritual. Festivals featured winners for the best aged curd, and markets set standards for weight and salt. Because cheese didn't need immediate cooking, it often served as midday sustenance. Holes from aging cheese not only showed maturity, but also lightness to carry. Shepherds, travellers, and workers could carry wedges wrapped in cloth, no hearth required. It was compact, caloric, and safe. Far moister meals had to be shimmed into soups or stews. Cheese did stand-alone work. Worth noting, cheese also served medicinal purposes. Medieval physicians prescribed local cheeses soaked in wine as restorative or rubbed along wounded limbs as salve. Hard cheese, raspings dissolved in vinegar, were considered treatments for colds or digestion troubles. These uses reflected cheese's dual role as both food and folk medicine. Yet it wasn't without risk. Some poorly manufactured wheels hosted unhelpful microbes. Too much moisture meant mould. Too little salt meant early decay. People learned to tap, taste, and sniff cheese before consumption, and to reserve suspect wheels for cooking or animal feed. Cheese shaped medieval diets, part nourishment, part engineering, part culture. In an era of scarcity and spoilage, it transformed fragile milk into something stronger. It bridged the gap between pastures and pantries, between freshness and famine. So, was it all that bad? It's easy to imagine the medieval table as bleak affair, a single wooden bowl, a crust of bread, and a hopeless ladle of lukewarm gruel. That image, like much of history passed through modern eyes, is only part of the truth. Because while hardship was real and hunger ever present, not every meal was misery. In fact, many medieval diets, especially when viewed across regions and seasons, were surprisingly wholesome, varied, and even delicious. For one, the land itself dictated much of what made it to the table. In the warm embrace of southern Europe, where olives grew fat and figs sweetened in the sun, people ate what we might today call a Mediterranean diet. Olive oil instead of butter, chickpeas and lentils stewed with herbs, dried fruits and honey-glazed pastries, fresh vegetables year-round, fish grilled over open flame. The sea and the sun were generous, and so their tables reflected that abundance. In contrast, Northern Europe's colder climate meant a heartier fare. Root vegetables, preserved meats, heavy breads, and warming stews, rye and barley instead of wheat, butter and lard rather than oil. Apples, leeks, and cabbage filled the gaps in winter, while wild greens and berries offered relief come spring. These meals were less elegant perhaps, but no less satisfying, full of calories, crafted for labour and built to endure. And then there were the feast days. For all the fasting, there was feasting. Roasted goose stuffed with herbs, creamy sauces thickened with egg and spice, meat pies in pastry shells filled with venison or pigeon or pork, towering cheese wheels so large they had to be cut with an axe, trenchers soaked in meat gravy, ale and mead flowing freely, honeyed cakes and spiced wine in the colder months. Even the peasants, when the harvest was good or the saints smiled kindly, shared in this bounty. And yes, there was gruel, but also garlicky sausage, spiced chickpea balls, flatbreads from hot stones, eel pies, rabbit stew. And in the monasteries, slow-simmered soups full of lentils, barley and whatever the garden gave. So no, it wasn't all that bad. Sometimes it was downright delightful. So as the firelight softens and the night folds gently around your thoughts, let us leave behind the tired myth of medieval food as flavourless sludge spooned from a communal pot. Yes, the Middle Ages had their hardships, and yes, not everyone ate richly or often. But woven into that tapestry of toil was something quietly beautiful, a food culture shaped by seasons, soil, and the slow rhythm of necessity. It was a world where people knew their meals intimately. They knew where their herbs grew wild. They knew the weight of bread dough in their own hands. They knew how long to smoke a ham or soak barley or coax flavour from broth. They ate not for indulgence but for survival, and still they found ways to season it with joy. This was a time of deeply regional tastes. A peasant in Tuscany tasted basil and sun-ripened figs. A fisherman in Normandy salted cod beside baskets of apples. A nun in York sipped ale with her oatcakes. Every table told a different story, not only of status, but of soil and season, of tradition passed down by hand, not text. There was creativity, too, in composts and frumenty, in pies of goose and pigeon, in almond milk stews and bright yellow saffron buns. There were saints, day feasts and fasting day recipes, each one a reflection of resilience and ingenuity. Even the simplest dish, a cabbage stew, a hunk of aged cheese, carried with it the knowledge of hundreds of years. So no, medieval people didn't just eat gruel. They ate what the land offered, what the season allowed, what the weather hadn't taken. They cooked with fire, with patience, and with a kind of reverence modern kitchens have nearly forgotten. Their meals weren't just sustenance, they were survival, community, and memory. And maybe in the quiet moments before sleep, that's worth remembering. Now, tell me, if you could try one medieval dish, just one, what would it be? Would it be a buttery hunk of trencher soaked in roast drippings? A sweet-spiced lamprey pie meant for kings? Or maybe just a thick slice of soft cheese beside a hunk of rye and a mug of warm ale? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you'd try or what you'd avoid. And until next time, rest well. You're not going hungry tonight.